Okay, everyone, this is not a drill. We are starting. Please take your seats. Charge your coffee cups, take pastries or bagels or anything provided generously by Revolution 250. Take your seats and settle in. We're going to begin our program. I'll wait until the room is quiet. It's okay, I can wait. All right, everybody, welcome to the Hive 2024. So to get things started, I'd like to introduce our superintendent, Simone Monteleone.
Good morning, everyone. It is so good to see you all. Speak closely, sorry. It's so good to see you all. As Jim said, welcome to the 2024 Hive. Great numbers here. It's so exciting. Before we get started, I just had a few thanks. So first off, I want to thank the Friends of Minuteman National Park. And I think I see Kathleen Fahey, our executive director. There she is. Bob Morris is here as well, the president, and we have some board members. So just a big thank you to the Friends. Really, without their support, we wouldn't be able to do so many things at the park, including the Hive. So thank you. Sure. In addition, I'd like to thank our host, Colonel Love and the Massachusetts Army National Guard for welcoming us back here to the Concord Armory. So we had the chance to be here last year for the first time, and it was really, really exciting to be engaged again with the community here at the Armory. So thank you very much, Colonel Love. I'd also like to thank Revolution 250. I think Jonathan Lane is here somewhere. There he is. So a big thank you to Rev 250 for supporting this event. In particular for the very generous food. So thank you so much, Jonathan. Another great partner for us for the 250th. He's been everywhere. I don't know how you do it, Jonathan, but thank you for that. And then finally, I'd also like to thank Freedom's Way National Heritage Area. So Patrice Tedisco, the executive director, she's here with us as well. Once again, Freedom's Way, we're just one of the organizations that she supports through the heritage area, but really a key partner for us as we look ahead to the 250th. So before I hand it off, I also want to thank the staff at Minuteman National Historical Park, in particular Ranger Jim and Ranger Jared, there he is, Ranger Jared. So the staff, and in particular the two of them, really are the force to get the Hive organized. They have set up a great suite of sessions and speakers for you today and tomorrow. So I hope you enjoy it. So thanks so much for being here.
And next up is Colonel Jeff Love of the Massachusetts Army National Guard.
Good morning. So, on behalf of the Adjutant General, Major General Gary Keefe, I'd like to welcome you back, welcome the Hive back to Concord State Armory and the Massachusetts National Guard Museum. Since you were here last, we've made some improvements to the sound system. I hope you agree. And we've brought public Wi-Fi into the building. And we'll be making some significant updates to the facility and the exhibits over the next few years. But as we grow, we'll consider it a privilege to continue to share our space and help our friends and partners in the living history community. So we hope to see you back again. Enjoyed the symposium. Thank you.
And next I'd like to introduce Kathleen Fahey of the Friends of Minuteman National Historical Park.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today for the Hive. On behalf of the Friends, we'd like to thank you all the interpreters, reenactors, volunteers that help make history come alive here at Minuteman National Historical Park. My name is Kathleen Fahey. I'm the Executive Director of the Friends of Minuteman. And I know many of you are familiar with the Friends, but those of you who are not, the Friends of Minuteman National Park is the official nonprofit partner of the park, and we support education, events, and preservation at the park. Sorry about that. Just to tell you a little bit more about the Friends and what we do. One of the things we do is we write grants and do fundraising for the park. One of the things that we're really excited to support at the park is the Black Powder Program and the tactical demonstrations. And the Friends provides a good portion of the black powder that the park uses every year, and also provides black powder to volunteers for use at different events. And these are some of the most popular events that visitors come to see. The Friends is also proud to support the Living History program through the historic clothing program. We have purchased fabrics and patterns last year. This year we're really excited to support the purchase of a Royal Artillery uniform. And it's funny because I was talking to Joel Bowie today, who's with us, and Joel pointed out that the picture that I have of the Royal Artillery uniform that was made by Don Triani is actually owned by Joel Bowie, and I didn't know that ahead of time, so that was kind of a fun coincidence. And we have a lot of great partners that we work with on these different programs, like the Society of the Cincinnati, the Massachusetts chapter, Freedom's Way National Heritage Area, Mass Cultural Council, and the Foundation for Metro West. The other thing that the Friends do is we love to support park programs. Some of our favorite programs would be Patriots Day and the upcoming 250th events, and we're really proud again to support the Black Powder program at Patriots Day. But the really fun thing that we get to do is we get to support the different animals that are at the events. So one thing we do is we contribute to the transportation of the horses that come to the events and the oxen that will be coming to the event, I believe this year. And of course, the buses that the reenactors take to get around the park and over to Tower Hill is also provided by the Friends. Some of the other events that we're highly active in would also be Halloween, if you've seen us at the welcome tent at that event. And Park Day is a great cleanup day. We have them in the spring and in the fall. So I encourage you to join us for that. We do landscape projects to help keep the park looking great. The Friends also does some of our own limited programming. One of the things that we like to do is the winter lecture series because the park is actually closed, or the visitor centers are closed, I should say. The landscape is open all year long. But while the visitor centers are closed, the Friends has a long tradition of holding a winter lecture or a winter lecture series. These are always free and open to the public. So I invite you all to join us for that. We've got two great two great lectures coming up in February and March of 2024. They're both focused on drinking in colonial America. And I have some small little brochures at the Friends registration check-in table if you're interested in joining us. And I also thought it was appropriate to make coasters this year as our giveaway swag. So I made coasters for the lectures to give away at the lectures, but I brought some here with me today as well. So if you want to pick up a free coaster or a free sticker on your way out, those are at the Friends table. The other exciting thing that the Friends has launched would be called Minuteman Soldier Search. This is available on our website, and what we did is we worked with a developer and volunteers to basically get a database of about 4,000 soldiers who participated on April 9th, 1775. This is based on Frank Coburn's 1912 book. So obviously there could be mistakes, there could be omissions. So we're really asking people to help us with this Minuteman Soldier Search database. If you go on there and see that somebody is missing, please let us know. We want to make sure that we have proper documentation of everybody who participated on April 19, 1775. If you're interested in checking this out, also at the Friends table, I have little business cards that have the Minuteman Soldier Search website link on it. So take a look for the little business card holder and you can grab one of those and check it out at home. Now, we'd love, you are all involved in the park already, but we'd love for you to get involved with the Friends as well. One of the ways that you can get involved is to become a member. We'd love story ideas for our monthly email newsletter, which you should all be receiving after registering for this event if you don't already receive the email newsletter. So if you have an article idea, we'd love to hear about it. We'd love to have you join us for our upcoming free events. In addition to the winter lecture series, we also do garden tours and bird walks in the spring and the summer. And also please like us on Facebook and Instagram. So again, I'd like to thank you all for coming today and for supporting the park and supporting the Friends. And I hope you have a wonderful time at the Hive today and tomorrow. Thank you.
And that's enough. Okay, so next I'd like to introduce Jonathan Lane of Revolution 250.
Thanks, Joe.
Right up to the mic.
That's perfect. Good morning, everybody. Just barely got it under the wire. Good morning, everyone. I was saying to Kathleen as we were standing by the side that I was going to pander to the crowd by thanking you all for all that you do for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts in bringing history to the masses. And really, when we talk about the 250th anniversary, I think we all know we couldn't do it without you. Nor would we want to. I mean, this is a great, interesting, fun-loving group. Sitting here talking while people are stitching or knitting, it actually reminds me of my childhood. So we could just throw in a little Nantucket basket making and maybe some Sailor's Valentines. We'd get the whole range of the activities my mother participated in. Lots of stuff to talk about today, probably too much for one sitting, but let me give you some updates on America 250 and Massachusetts 250 and Revolution 250. So America 250, as many of you probably know, did participate in the Boston Tea Party. They saw it as an excellent opportunity to kick off their efforts, and while it may not have come in as early as we might have wished, we're excited about the possibilities moving forward. We've already indicated to them that April 19th, Bunker Hill, June 17th and 2025, and then the Knox Trail are going to be, for our relationship with them, the signature events we'd like them to help us out with, particularly monetarily. So stay tuned on how all that plays out. They are moving ahead with, What America Means to Me, which is their kickoff program. They are definitely engaging with communities throughout the nation, which is exciting. But in reality, when it comes to commemorating the 250th, what we're really talking about is we're talking about what we do here. And this is, even if you go back to the bicentennial and all the things that I remember as a child in the bicentennial, the most important events are the ones that we devised locally. So I've been working with the Massachusetts Office of Travel and Tourism, who has a new 250th coordinator. Hopefully there'll be some grant programs coming out of that to help support communities across the Commonwealth in putting programs together. And then communities up and down the coastline and as far west of the Berkshires. We had a great meeting with some folks out in the Berkshires last week, so we're really excited about the possibilities. We'll be doing, for those of you who may be in the area, on April 3rd, we're going to do a county-wide meeting for Berkshire County to sort of get input, to help drive attention, to help build awareness, to encourage putting programs together that are meaningful for the people of those communities. We've been doing a lot of work with Essex County, obviously, out here in Metro West, which is, of course, leagues ahead of everybody else. It may not feel like it some days, but it is true. Plymouth County, in particular, looking at raising the image, raising the awareness, attention to Mercy Otis Warren, which we're very excited to help and support as well. The State Commission continues in its advisory role. I think there are a lot of good individual people on this commission who are doing good work in their own communities. And for the 250th, I'm excited about Ray Shepard, who's a local man from Lincoln, who's on the commission. He's working on a book on underrepresented voices of the American Revolution, which we're, as I'm sure many of you know, particularly keen to tell those stories at Revolution 250. It's something we've been working on since I joined the staff. And I will say also, there are opportunities for you to get involved, not that you don't have enough to do already. And I know how taxed your time is, and I am very grateful for all that you do, but there is more work to do. There are communities who are looking, for instance, Ipswich in particular is looking for groups of people who'd be willing to come and participate in a 250th anniversary reenactment of the Ipswich Convention. That'll be in September of this year. There are other communities who are looking to do similar things. Worcester is looking to do one, potentially Plymouth or Barnstable County, so stay tuned on those. I did bring with me a couple of items just for your information. So the people at Meet Boston, who, as some of you may remember, was once the Greater Boston Convention and Visitors Bureau, now is Meet Boston. They've been already getting requests from tours and tour handlers about what's planned for 2025, 2026. So I did put together a document for them just so that they would have something to refer to. It's not absolutely complete, obviously. We don't include every last lecture, talk, walk, hike, or monument unveiling, of which there will be many over the coming years. But it is something for people to be getting on with. I have about 40 copies with me today. I'll bring some more tomorrow. So if you don't get one today, just see me tomorrow and we'll make sure that happens. I do want to highlight a couple of things that obviously 2024 is going to be busy with county conventions and provincial congress and those sorts of things heading towards. But one of the things that we're hoping to push this year is a program that started right here at Minuteman, which is the Patriot Vigil. And we're hoping to push this out across the Commonwealth. We've already begun working with partners up in Essex County, down in Plymouth County, and I'll be presenting it to Berkshire County when I go out there in April. But it's the idea of turning April 18th, as I'm sure many of you are aware, Jim's great program on standing vigil the night before April 19th, as a mark of respect for those who served and sacrificed so much for us 250 years ago. We're keen to promote that story and to promote the work of not just the men who went off to war, but the women and families they left behind. I was just up in Gloucester last week, there's a great statue in the Cape Ann Museum, which if you haven't been to the Cape Ann Museum, I would put it on your must-do list. A great picture, it's from World War I, and it's a woman holding a child looking out to sea, and just the simple inscription on the statue is, "They also served." And I think it's a really powerful reminder that it's not just the 25% or so of the men who go off to war, but we need to remember the families and people that supported them in their efforts in the field. Lots of parade things, obviously. There are going to be two announcements this year, one for obviously the commemorative year of 2025, April 19th, 2025, Bunker Hill. So obviously there's not much room for a reenactment in Cambridge, although there's plenty of activities planned for Bunker Hill Day 2025. The Bunker Hill Parade, they are looking for the Bunker Hill Parade 2025 to get representation from every community that had soldiers at Bunker Hill in 1775. So that's a pretty tall order, but they certainly have the will to do it. They certainly have some resources to hand, and I'm excited to help them pursue that. Also good to remember that this is the first of 2 years celebrating the bicentennial of the visit of the Marquis de Lafayette. We're working with the American Friends of Lafayette to put together a series of programs. Some of you may know this because I sent out a request looking for suggestions for anybody who knows a Lafayette reenactor. Anyway, they'll be doing programs in August and September of this year, and then again next year leading up to June 17th, 2025, when they'll celebrate the bicentennial of Lafayette laying the cornerstone to the Bunker Hill Monument. And then the 2025 is, I think, pretty self-explanatory, although it's important to remember that while the focus of many people is on Lexington and Concord, there are so many stories in these communities to tell that are looking for ways to tell them. And so any opportunity you have, or if you hear of anything, if you hear of something that people are planning, need help with, please feel free to reach out to me. Would love to help them tell their story any way they can. Also keep in mind that for 2 days, it looks like it's going to be the 15th and 16th of April, 2025. Ken Burns' new series on the American Revolution is going to be released, and they'll be doing press events and pre-release parties in Boston, Lexington, and Concord those 2 days. So I'm sure many of you may appear in this in one form or another. So stay tuned for some of those exciting opportunities. I'm hoping that it will be as successful as his Civil War series was, which served as an inspiration to all of us. And then, of course, running downhill towards 2026, we'll be having a long conversation with people in the Berkshires and beyond about the Knox Trail, which is, I know there are people who are working on this already. Obviously, our friends out in New York are a league ahead of us, but, particularly with oxen. And they'll be looking for ways to engage with the people of Massachusetts. There are other parties who are interested in being involved in this story. The Teamsters Union is interested in getting involved, so we're hoping to see them as a potential source of funding. We'll also be working with the Massachusetts Grand Lodge, which has a particular interest in Knox and Knox's Trail, and all of the other events for 2026 leading up to Evacuation Day, which we sort of see as our grand celebration for 2026. Not to say that we're not going to do the 4th of July. Of course we're going to celebrate the 4th of July, but for those of us in Massachusetts, really we need to promote, celebrate, push the Evacuation Day celebration, because it is a massive achievement for people 250 years ago and really represents that moment when the people of Massachusetts led the way towards the independence of the American people, and we want to make sure to celebrate that. We're hoping to do a number of programs regionally. We've been meeting regionally with representatives from all of the New England states, obviously looking ahead towards the Knox Trail, that's part of it. The capture of Fort Ticonderoga, that's another program we're looking to do. There's a number of people discussing Arnold's March to Quebec, so we've been in discussions with people on that, particularly since it involves so many regional communities. We are, where's that going? Oh, regional, right. So, and of course, you know, looking ahead towards 2027, Saratoga and that kind of stuff. There's a lot of opportunity for people moving forward. I also did bring with me, for those of you who may be interested, I do have a selection, not a selection, I have multiple copies of Massachusetts and the Revolution. These are historical dates. These are not the dates events are actually going to take place. Don't confuse the two. But it's meant to be a piece that reminds the people of Massachusetts that, as John Adams said, and I know we all know the quote, you know, the revolution really did occur in the hearts and minds of the people, and we are across Massachusetts, and we want to help every community find their 250th moment in the sun. So thanks very much, and if you have any questions, I'll be putting out cookies and brownies for this afternoon snack.
So before we begin discussing Revolution 250 themes, and with Jared and I here, I'd like to call Glenn Siner up to the front, please.
Thank you, Jim. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Glenn Siner, and I'm with Two's Company of the 2nd Rhode Island Regiment. And if you don't know me, most of you here probably knew my good friend and colleague, Brian Mello, who a very important part of Two's Company and a very dear friend of mine, and to more than one person in this room, who passed away 2 days ago after a very valiant fight with cancer. I think many of you in this room have one of Brian's canteens. He was kind of a canteen maker to the star. I called him one of his cartridge boxes, or any other one of the myriad things that he would make for people. He never said no. Always did his best to get them to you in a timely fashion. And so every time you go onto the field, I'm sorry. Every time you go on the field with something that Brian made for you, you're taking a little piece of him with you. So every time you take a drink of water from the canteen when you're thirsty, that's Brian. Every time you fix your bayonet to your musket from a scabbard that he made, that glint on its blade is Brian. You know, every time you take a cartridge from your cartridge box and your musket fires, you have that brilliant flash, just like Brian. That was Brian. I'm sorry. Brian died as he lived. A strong, courageous, righteous, loving man, and literally died in the arms of his family. And I, for one, cannot think of a better way to leave this world. And this world will be a poor place for Brian not being in it. I will miss my friend terribly. Many people in the reenacting community will miss him terribly. His family, suffice to say, will desperately miss him. But he leaves behind this legacy of friendship and goodwill that I think is virtually unsurpassed. And if you would, and help me honor my friend and comrade Brian, would you all mind standing for a moment of silence? We love you, Brian. Thank you so much.
All right. So what we'd like to talk about, this is just a little mini session, so not terribly long. Over the past several months, Jared and I have been working to come up with, since we get this 250th happening, to come up with a framework, an interpretive framework. Where are we going to go? And it's a multi-year process. So Jared and I would like to outline what we've come up with and share it with you, as it will be a guide to what we're going to be doing together over the next few years at least.
Hello, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jared Foos. I'm one of the park rangers at Minuteman, and like Jim said, we've been working over the last few months, probably over a year now at this point in time, to put together kind of our grand plan for the next 8 years at Minuteman National Historical Park as we cover the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. And I will start this by saying that I think Minuteman is very particularly situated in that not only are we covering the first major battle of the American Revolution, but we're covering what caused it, what led up to it. So that means that not only does our programming happen in 2025, but that means that it happens in 2024, in 2023. We've already started. So what we'd like to give you all a little bit of a sneak peek through today is what we're going to be talking about, how we're going to organize the next 8 years at Minuteman, and some of the programs that we're going to be doing, special programs throughout the course of the years that you all might be able to help us with, and we would love to see more of you all out there helping throughout the rest of the year as well. So just a little bit of an overview of how this is organized. We have broken those 8 years up into 3 kind of larger categories of time frame that cover different thematic topics. And within those larger categories, we're going to have even smaller categories that cover smaller sections of time. Really, we've probably planned out almost moment by moment the next 8 years of what we'd like to talk about and what we'd like to cover, because there's a lot, as you can imagine. So the first phase of this we're calling Rise to Rebellion, and that is going to run from December of 2023, around the time period of the Tea Party, and it's going to go all the way up. I don't know if you have the PowerPoint. We'll get there in a second. But it's going to go all the way up about the time period just before April 19th of 2025. And at that point, we will switch over to the next major phase, which is Rebellion and Road to Revolution, which is kind of covering that phase where the war has begun, but how do we then move off in a direction of revolution itself? Following that phase, which will end in July 5th of 2026, will be our America Unfinished phase. So finishing out the war and then the legacy of the American Revolution afterwards. So we have these big overarching time frames that we're going to be working with, and there's a lot of things that we're trying to accomplish within those time frames. Some of the big ones we've listed up here in this PowerPoint, and if anybody would like a copy of this PowerPoint, I'm sure we can get it to them later. And we also have copies of the draft that we can show off at any point in time, and it's on our website now. So if anybody wants to even just get on our website on your phone and follow along, you're more than welcome to check it out. But one of the big things that we'd like to encourage is generating an understanding and a discussion amongst our staff, our volunteers, and our visitors of really the uncomfortable and complex issues that start around the time period of the Tea Party and before, and lead up extending all the way through this year, 1774. Those issues dividing communities, turned neighbor against neighbor, and ultimately led to a military confrontation in 1775, which is what you're about to hear about next. We're going to explore the history of the Revolution as an experience by everyday living people in the moment, unaware of what the outcome would be. As Jim likes to say, we try not to read history backwards or read it in the past. This is something that these people were living, that they experienced, and they had no idea what was about to happen, and we'd like to convey that through our program that we're going to do. And we'll be exploring some other things, and I think we can probably move to the next slide for sake of expediency. But like I said, the overarching structure of this is we'll be breaking it down into kind of larger phases and then smaller sub-phases. So I'm actually going to turn it over to Jim to start talking about some of those larger phases and getting into some of the themes and the content that we're going to cover in those phases and in the smaller sub-themes.
So right now, we are in the first phase, so Rise to Rebellion. So that's roughly from the Tea Party, the 250th of the Tea Party, which has just passed, and continuing all the way through up to, but not including, the Battle of Bunker Hill. And so for our themes, as interpretation, and Jared will go over, you always have to have a theme statement that kind of maps out where you're going with this, what's your goal. So for our theme statement for this phase of the revolution, when a people's self-determination and political voice are taken away, it is their right to resist. So there's a lot in that statement. How are people feeling? And so we've developed a series of essential theme questions. So this is next level stuff here in terms of writing an interpretive program, because history is really about questions. So would you defend the rule of law by breaking it? At what point, if ever, is violence justified? What does it mean to be a radical or radicalized? What is justice? How do we rebuild society when elements of it collapse? How do we respond to dissent and disagreement during times of crisis? So again, looking at the lived experience of the revolution, looking back at these questions, imagine this is what you're facing on a day-to-day basis. It's kind of terrifying. Everything that they had known was being turned on its head, and they were going into uncharted territory. So these questions are designed when we're developing programs. This is what we're referring back to. And I think using the medium of living history, which we're all a big fan of, this is going to kind of drive us to be a little bit more creative and try new types of programming and new ways to use living history and really good content to provoke thought. That's why we interpret. We want to not just inform, but provoke thought. The next phase is the first phase in this is catalyst, so the Tea Party through May. So this is one of the subcategories. So Rise to Rebellion was the overarching. This is the subcategory. So people often reach their breaking point when they believe the price of doing nothing is heavier than the risk of doing something. So again, that's our theme statement for this early phase. It's going to take us through May of 1774. And here's some of the key events. And this is both in-person events and digital. I've just got a few of them. So the Boston Tea Party in real time, so we've already been going through that. So on our Facebook and Instagram. And of course, the Hive, that's where we are right now. So congratulations, you're all participating in the 250th right now. And then last month, we did the Concord Town Meeting. January 10, 1774, Jared and I ran a facilitated dialogue, an audience-centered experience at the Concord Library, putting to them questions about how the people of Concord had to wrestle with whether or not to ban the consumption of tea in their homes and to consider those who violate the ban to be enemies. What does it mean to call somebody an enemy? What are the implications of that? And that's exactly what they were dealing with. So you can see some of the other, the tarring and feathering of John Malcolm, so that was digital. And also we're having a naturalization ceremony at the North Bridge in May. So lots of special things coming up. Radicalization. So this is from June to October this year. And so this covers basically the closure of the Port of Boston through the formation, the dissolution of the Massachusetts legislature, just getting up to the formation of the provincial Congress. So obviously a key time that Bob Allison will be talking about shortly. Oops, go back. So here we have for radicalization, when people feel they can no longer hold systems of authority accountable, radical thinking and radical action increases. Imagine, these are law-abiding British subjects all of a sudden saying, hey, you know, our parliament, our legislature's been dissolved, and we're going to form our own. Where do we go from here? And so these are some of the events that we're going to be picking out. And we may be calling on some of you to help us with these things. The big one, of course, June 1st, the closure of the Port of Boston, how that's... closure of the Port of Boston and how that's going to impact the families, not only in Boston, but out in the countryside. The Enemy Among Us, July 13th. So we're hoping to recruit some of our friends on the Crown side to talk about the Army coming into Boston and people interacting with soldiers on a large scale, larger than they've ever experienced before. Neighbor against neighbor. So this is where you get the polarization happening. You know, you no longer know if you can trust the person you're talking to. We're going to be talking about the experience of people of color, enslaved and free as well, on the edge of liberty. Non-importation, non-consumption, so that was where the people are fighting back and trying to hit them in the pocketbooks to try to avert disaster. The powder alarm, of course, is going to be a big one in early September. The formation of the Provincial Congress in October, and closing the courts in September. We're also going to be doing an artillery program in September, so more on that soon. Jared and I both love artillery. Does anyone here like artillery? Does anyone here want to help us with a gun crew maybe someday? We've come to the right place. Oh yeah, Andy, you and I got to talk. Good. So now we're getting serious. So this is organizations. This is covering the formation of the Provincial Congress through April 17 of 2025. So now we're getting, pushing into that critical phase where, people are radicalized, they're angry, the lines are being drawn, but now they're getting organized and again, getting ready to fight back. They're already doing non-consumption, non-importation, but now they're starting to look to a military option. You can see the theme statement here. Organization and preparation are critical elements that contribute to the success of collective action. So, far from just being an angry rabble, they're highly organized and extremely dangerous. So, looks like my slides are out of order here. No, they're not. So here are some of the key events that we're going to be doing. So preparing for winter, preparing for war. This year, so this October, that's going to be a big push. We did it last year. Day one, Saturday, we covered Patriot point of views, the hot Whigs, if you will. And on Sunday, we covered Loyalist points of view. And man, we had some great conversations, reenactors and visitors really got it. And they really started to understand what it might have been like to live through those times. And they're drawing on their own experiences from modern day as well and trying to learn from history. So it was really good, and we're really hoping, and we enjoyed the support of the Ladies Association for this. We had the 4th Regiment of Foot, the 10th Regiment of Foot, we had the Lexington Minutemen, 2nd Massachusetts. So we're looking for more help with that to make it even bigger, because this will be the 250th of that. And of course, we're looking to do lecture on warlike supplies with our very own Joel Boy, who's sitting over there in the corner doing something, God knows what. Never mind, we'll get to him later. And Leslie's Raid in February of 2025, that'll be digital content. spies in Concord, again, getting back to that idea of who you can trust, and parliamentary pressures being brought to bear. Then we get into rebellion, so this is probably familiar territory for most of us. And the theme statement, so this is, of course, covering the outbreak of war on April 19th. When people in a political crisis reach an impasse, they can either submit and abandon their convictions or confront oppression. And you can see, obviously, these are a lot of our Patriots Day events that we run every year. Just in 2025, they're going to be bigger. As you know, we've been practicing, trying to get a form down so that in 2025 we can execute. We're going to be on a major stage with tens of thousands of people watching us. So we want this to go like a military operation. So these events should look fairly familiar. The Patriot Vigil, as Jonathan Lane had talked about, we have the live event at the North Bridge. The talk about Paul Revere's Ride, Battle Road. Has anyone ever been to Battle Road? And the North Bridge and such. And then, of course, now we get into the Road to Revolution. So the Road to Revolution, so this is Bunker Hill through July 4th. So now it's like, okay, a war started, and the realities are kicking in. So I'm going to turn things over to Jared, who's going to take you from here.
Yeah, so like Jim said, now we're getting into that next major phase of the war. So the first being the rise to rebellion, how do we get to war itself? Now we're going into Road to Revolution. How do we go from a rebellion to an actual revolution? And that's why we've chosen the date after, or around, I should say, Bunker Hill, is that transition, as we're starting now to move towards, oh, maybe we can't put the pieces back together like we thought we could. But this will run through July 4th of 2026, which in all honesty is what the National Park Service as a large entity is gearing up for right now. Is there's a lot of emphasis being put on July 4th, 2026, the actual Declaration of Independence. So we're going to try and cover what gets us to the Declaration of Independence during this time frame. So the theme statement we've created for this one is, when conflict creates a watershed event, it can force people to reject previous conventions and pursue new aspirations. So again, they're grappling with that idea of, okay, the war is here, now what? There we go. So at this point in time, we'll also be looking into some essential theme questions, because again, like Jim said, these questions are helping us guide our interpretation, and these are really great for all of us. If you're doing programming out there, these are just open-ended questions to get people pondering, thinking about how this is relevant now in 2024 and 2025 and 2026. So things like, at what point is change necessary? What is a revolution? What can communities and individuals do to survive uncertain times? How do you maintain commitment through adversity? When decisions are made without your consent, what do you do? When decisions are made you disagree with, what do you do? So these are some really big societal grappling questions, and you may not have an answer to that, and that's fine, but it's provoking the thought of, how do I deal with this today, and how did they deal with it then? So some of the big things that we're going to be focusing on during this time period, obviously the Siege of Boston, wrapping up the Siege of Boston in early 2026. We'll probably be partnering with our partner Park Service sites around the area, including Boston, and we'll be covering some digital content with that, but then we'll also be looking at what's going on still in Concord during this time period, because Concord plays still a major role throughout the rest of the war. So things like the prisoners of war that are kept in Concord well over a year after April 19th of 1775. So what's their story? There's some really fun, maybe an episode of Great Escapes that we could do. But we'll also be talking about patriots of color in the area. We'll be talking about the Battle of Bunker Hill, obviously. The birth of the Continental Army in July of 2025. We'll be talking about what's going on the home front. All the stressors are being placed on the people who live around this area. They're now being forced to feed and supply massive armies sieging Boston. We'll be talking about Evacuation Day, and eventually this, like I said, will lead us up to the Declaration of Independence. Come on. Oh, there we go. So after July 4th of 2026, we'll be moving into our last phase, which will cover the next few years. And this is the least fleshed out phase because we're pretty far out from this right now. So this is a working document. We'll be adding more onto it as we go. But this phase will basically run from July 5th of 2026 through the rest of the war, so 2032-ish, and probably beyond. But this will really grapple with that, again, question, now what? We've declared our independence. What do we do afterwards? How do we put all this together? So we'll be covering contents like how do we build an equal and just society? What is liberty and who is it for? Are all Americans treated equal? What should political protests look like in a republic? And how do we treat those with whom we disagree? So these big societal questions that they are grappling with, again, we are still grappling with today, 250 years later. Some events that we'll be doing during that time period, we'll be, again, talking a lot about people of color in this area, slavery in Massachusetts, and we'll be doing programming. We titled Freedom for Who at this point in time, what that looks like in context to that time period. We'll be doing more naturalization ceremonies in the park. We'll be partnering with some of our other parks like Saratoga during the Saratoga campaign because as most of you know, there are a lot of men from this area that march off to fight in the Saratoga campaign or arrive just after it's over. And then they escort the convention army back to Boston. So we will be hopefully doing some major programming about the convention army when the time comes. We'll be also covering the Battle of Rhode Island because there's a lot of Massachusetts militia soldiers that go down for that fight as well. And then we'll also be covering general topics of the loyalist diaspora. What happened to all those people who were here pre-war that were loyalists and what their stories were and how they contribute to the broader narratives of the American Revolution and our legacy today. And then the last one that we put there is Lexington and Concord in historical memory. And this is something we already do in the park that we cover quite a bit is how do we talk about this? As I tell a lot of people who come to the park, I think 90% of Jim and I's job interacting with people who come to the park is taking things, mythology that we've heard from elsewhere, like Disney, and elsewhere, Johnny Tremaine, some of those bigger movies that we've seen, and kind of taking those and looking at what's true and what's not in those narratives and how we construct those narratives and maybe why we constructed those narratives in the first place. So the historical memory portion of this is something we're already doing and I highly recommend come talk to Jim and I afterwards because we have a lot of great content about this and if you're interested in it, it gets really big into the concept of words matter and how we describe and talk about those things from that time period also reflects on us today. And that pretty much wraps up our overview of what we're going to be doing over the next 8 years or so. And like I said, this is a working document, so we are continuously adding and updating new events, programs, things like that. So if anybody has any ideas and they want to partner with us or those sorts of collaborative processes, we're all open to that. So thank you all for letting us take a few minutes just to talk over all of what we're working on.
Right, so stay tuned. We will be definitely reaching out to everybody in this room for your help in kind of fleshing some of these things out. And I can say from personal experience, our visitors are very excited. You know, many of us who have had experience talking with visitors in the past year, they're feeling it. You know, that buzz about the 250th is real, and it's just growing and growing. Those of us who were at the Boston Tea Party event back in December, incredible. Just a sea of people flowing down Milk Street. Kind of terrifying, actually. But that's what's coming, and it's probably going to be even more. So get ready, buckle up. We're a little ahead of schedule. Does anybody have any questions about what we've laid out? Why can't we be friends? Yeah, I don't have that answer, Paul. We had a question out over here. Yes. Yes. So yeah, we do have the slide deck available. Do we have the events online? Yes. Okay, so on our homepage, you'll see a link for the 250th, and that'll take you to all these themes and our our event schedule. Now the event schedule, it's skeletal. You know, we've basically got an idea, a date, and whether it's going to be in person or digital. So when we get actually into executing these things, they'll also appear on our event calendar and in other places. But yeah, if you want to take a look at those, they're right on our homepage. Just click the link for 250th, and that'll take you to all of those. And if you want the slide deck in particular, we can get that to you as well. And I just love how photographic the park is too. It's like that one there, taken from Hartwell when we were doing a photo shoot. I think that was 2022. So anyway, and you all bring this park to life in so many ways. All right, so we have a few minutes before Professor Allison speaks to us. So if you need to recharge coffee cups, take a bathroom break, stretch, do whatever, I'll call you back in 15 minutes. Okay, everyone, so fill your coffee cups and take your seats. We're going to get started with our first, our keynote speaker in just a couple of minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. I just wanted to say, for those of you who may be traveling home today and need something in the car just to keep you going, please feel free to take a Ziploc bag at the table and take the snacks home, please. More snacks tomorrow, so we don't need any left from today. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. All right, yeah, so we turned the heat up for just a little bit, so now we've turned it off so that we can hear. If it does start to get cold, just keep your coats nearby. We're going to try to cycle the heat back on as needed, but it's hard to hear with the fans going. Okay. All right, so I'd like to introduce now Professor Bob Allison. So Professor Allison is the history chair at Suffolk University and the president of the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, of which Emily and I are proud members, and the chairman of Revolution 250. His books include the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Massacre, Stephen Decatur, American naval hero, A Short History of Boston, and The Crescent Obscured the United States and the Muslim World, 1776 to 1813. So Professor Allison has been very generously coming and speaking with us for a number of years now, chronicling for our community the march to war, year by year. I think we started, 2015, 2016, around there. So things are getting pretty serious now, as we are, as you can see on your screen, talking about the year 1774. So please welcome Professor Bob Allison.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. I want to thank you for organizing these events, bringing folks together here in the Hive year after year and beyond to think about how we can best represent these stories, keeping them alive so that 50 years, 100 years, 250 years from now, people will still be sharing them. And the year 1774 really is the year, I think, the revolution begins, in the sense John Adams used when he said that the American Revolution was finished before a drop of blood was spilled at Lexington Green. And you really see this happening in the year 1774. I'm also reminded my good friend, Professor Bob Gross, is here. Tomorrow he will be talking about this. And for the past year, he has been asking, and probably you've been asking this question for longer, how did we get from standing up for our sacred charter rights at the beginning of 1774 to making the cause universal human rights by the end of 1774? It's a great question to keep thinking about as this revolution is happening. And as you know, the big event in 1773 was the destruction of the tea, and many of us participated in the immediate past reenactment of this, and of course, that triggers a reaction in London. And the year begins, for the story of the revolution, I think, at the Privy Council. Back in 1773, when the Massachusetts Assembly wanted to recall Governor Thomas Hutchinson, they had asked their agent, Benjamin Franklin, to arrange to have Hutchinson replaced. And this involves the Privy Council meeting to discuss the merits of the Assembly's actions and so on. And of course, the news of the destruction of the tea reached London just a few days before Franklin's long-awaited Privy Council hearing. And his hearing before the Privy Council turned into an hour-long excoriation of Franklin by Alexander Wedderburn, the Solicitor General of the British Empire, who blamed Franklin for all of the trouble. He is not content with being here as the agent of a provincial assembly, Wedderburn said. Instead, he imagines himself to be the ambassador from an independent empire. And Franklin stood silently for an hour of abuse, actually masterful abuse by Wedderburn. His speech was printed and circulated in London, and what Franklin really noticed as he stood there were the faces around the room. This was a packed room. The Prime Minister had to find a place to stand. He actually was standing next to Jeremy Bentham in the back of the room. And everyone who was anyone in London society was here to watch Dr. Franklin, this American provincial who thought he actually belonged at the epicenter of the empire, taken down and put in his proper place. Franklin, it is said, went into the room hoping that by removing Hutchinson and replacing him with a governor that the Massachusetts Assembly could work with, hoping that this meeting could save the British Empire, left the room not thinking the British Empire was worth saving. That may not be the case, but it is the moment when Franklin switches from being a servant of the empire who had risen far within the empire's ranks to being an opponent of it. And all of this, we should remind ourselves, Wedderburn's attack on Franklin was really a defense of Governor Hutchinson. And by the end of 1773, Hutchinson was ruined in Massachusetts, was appealing to go to England to plead his case. The one thing that stops him in early 1773 from getting on a boat to London was the fact that the lieutenant governor, Andrew Oliver, had died. And there was no lieutenant governor, and Hutchinson knew if he left Boston, if he left Massachusetts, the Assembly and the Governor's Council would take power, and he wanted to avoid that. So Hutchinson remains in this bitterly contested Boston of 1774. As I said, Andrew Oliver dies, and the big cause here in Massachusetts, at least the big political cause, was the fact that actually Oliver's other brother, Peter Oliver, survived. He was the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Superior Court, and he had agreed to receive a salary from the Crown. Things were so contested that Andrew Oliver's funeral, actually, people huzzahed when his body was lowered into its grave, and Peter Oliver, his brother, was told not to attend. His safety could not be guaranteed. So it's hard for us to imagine a time when things were so polarized, and even funerals became political events. But this is the state of things in Boston, the state of things as Franklin found in London in early 1774. Thomas Gage wrote to Hutchinson from London early in 1774 that people are talking more seriously than ever about America. That crisis is come when the provinces must be either British colonies or independent and separate states. What will be done, nobody, I believe, can yet tell. And this is what's happening as in 1774 we see the empire and her North American colonies really beginning to separate. I mentioned, well, another episode in January of 1774. John Malcolm was a customs officer from Maine, and he had been tarred and feathered up in what is now Portland, Maine. And he comes to Boston hoping to get some redress for this affront, this attack on a customs official. And in January of 1774, he is tarred and feathered again in Boston. In fact, Governor Hutchinson, who was quite sympathetic, of course, to Malcolm, also said he might have brought it on himself, that people found him annoying and obnoxious, aside from everything else. By the way, one of my favorite stories to tell when I'm walking along the Freedom Trail in Boston is at the grave of Captain Daniel Malcolm, who was a true son of liberty, his grave tells us, and an enemy to oppression and foremost to opposing the revenue acts in North America. And his gravestone in the Copp's Hill burying ground is marked by chips taken out allegedly by British soldiers when Copp's Hill was fortified during the Battle of Bunker Hill. And he wanted to be buried at least 10 feet down so he would be beyond the reach of any British revenue officer. He died in 1769 at the height of the non-importation crisis. He was Daniel Malcolm's brother. John Malcolm and Daniel Malcolm were brothers. They came from a family of 9 sons. They were the closest in age. So this split between colonies and the mother country was also a split among families, with people choosing different sides in this growing crisis. Now, as I mentioned, the big story for us politically was the Crown offering salaries to the judges on the Superior Court as a way of keeping them not susceptible to the whims of the Boston mob. And in February of 1774, every judge on the Massachusetts Superior Court agreed he would not accept the salary. And every judge except one, and that one was Peter Oliver, who also was related by marriage to Governor Hutchinson. Their children had intermarried. The Hutchinsons and the Olivers were quite close. Are there any Hutchinsons or Olivers here? I always speak guardedly when I'm talking about them. No one wants to identify themselves, I guess, as a Hutchinson or an Oliver in this crowd. So this is the big issue. Who will pay the judges? And Oliver winds up being impeached. John Adams, I believe it was, proposed impeaching him because according to the Assembly and according to men like Adams, accepting a salary from the crown violated the Massachusetts charter, and judges who violate the charter should be impeached. The problem was, as members of the assembly pointed out to Adams, no assembly had ever impeached a crown official before. That's problem number one. Problem number two, if we impeach Judge Oliver, impeachment, as we know all too well now, is an indictment by one house of the assembly. The trial is then held in the next house, and the next house is the governor's council, and presiding at the governor's council is Thomas Hutchinson, who would receive this bill of impeachment and say the assembly cannot impeach crown officials, and that would be the end of it. Adams says, well, we still have to do this, and they do. So in early 1774, the assembly impeaches Judge Oliver, and predictably, when Governor Hutchinson receives this at the governor's council, he says the assembly cannot impeach crown officials. That's the end of it. And this would have been the end of it until Judge Oliver went to Charlestown to convene a session of the court, and the jurors, the first thing you do when you're having a trial is impanel a jury, and these jurors come in, they look at the bench, and they say, we can't serve in this court because you have been impeached by our assembly. We can't sit in a court over which you preside until this matter has been resolved. And of course, for Hutchinson and Oliver, the matter had been resolved. Assemblies can't impeach crown officials. For these jurors in Charlestown, it had not been resolved. They get up and walk out. Oliver cannot impanel a jury in Massachusetts. And the theory that Oliver, Hutchinson, and the British ministry had was that all of the trouble was in Boston, all of the trouble was caused by James Otis and Samuel Adams, and now they're finding that the trouble extends far beyond Boston. And it's not simply a group of radicals in Boston, but it's ordinary citizens in the rest of Massachusetts who are deciding how they will be governed, and they won't be governed according to the rules that Hutchinson, Oliver, and the British ministry are making. Of course, the other big thing aside from this is that in response to the destruction of the tea, Parliament in January, February of 1774 closes the port of Boston. The Boston Port Act, which will take effect on the 1st of June. No commerce in or out of Boston until Boston pays the East India Company for the tea destroyed in December of 1773, shutting down Boston's commerce. And you would think that this would be a real boon, or perhaps Parliament was thinking this will be a boon to the other ports in New England, like Salem or Marblehead, but instead the other ports rally to Boston's aid. This isn't something we can anticipate, but it is what happens. And Josiah Quincy writes Josiah Quincy writes a pamphlet, Observations on the Port Bill, which raises these issues, not just Boston is closed, we are all going to starve, but Boston is closed. This is punishing the innocent along with the guilty. It also shows us the dangers of a standing army, that is, a military force is being sent to Boston to enforce the Port Act. So his observations on the Port Bill becomes a very powerful articulation of these ideas of independence and not being subject to the power of arbitrary force in the form of British troops. And when Quincy arrives in London in the fall of 1774, he sees copies of his observations on the desks of people like Lord Dartmouth and Lord North, that is, the officials of the British government, who have read this defense of not only American rights, but the fundamental ideas of liberty to which the British also profess their support. And it seems in early 1774, as I said, General Gage says we don't know where things are going. Reverend John Lathrop of the Second Church in Boston gives a sermon about unavoidable war. That's the general theory of it, a knowledge that war is coming and not knowing what it will mean. And he speculates how people 50 years from now will look back on this moment. When Boston's port was shut down, Massachusetts, the Assembly, and the other leaders of the opposition hoped to have general non-importation. Let's get all of the other colonies to agree with us not to import British goods. That's been the tactic we have used in the past. The call comes back from the other colonies. They would like to deliberate on this. They would like to have a general Congress to talk about this. Massachusetts was hoping they would all immediately join in this cause, but instead the other colonies want time to deliberate. And some of the Massachusetts radicals see the calling of a Congress as a way of putting off any kind of support for New England. But Lathrop sees something else at work in this. He speculates about what will happen. That is, would local differences and jealousies make united effort impossible, or would colonists hold a Congress and embark on a quiet and peaceful suspension of trade? That is, he sees a Congress as an opportunity. The other radicals in Massachusetts see the Congress as a potential trap. And Lathrop concludes by saying that life and death, in a political sense, are set before us. The fate of America for many generations depends on the virtues of her sons and daughters in the present day. So this is the state of things in early 1774, and then on May the 13th, General Thomas Gage arrives in Boston, hoping to avoid a war. That's really Gage's task, and it will be his task for almost a year until, as we know, a war does begin in April of 1775. But meanwhile, in the other colonies, people are getting together planning for a Congress. In Virginia, actually, the Virginia House of Burgesses met in May, and they called for a day of fasting and prayer on the 1st of June in solidarity with the people of Boston in their suffering, knowing that is the day the port of Boston is going to close. This is a great moment, as the Virginia House of Burgesses wants to support Massachusetts, so great that the governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, suspends the assembly. He does not want them calling for days of fasting and prayer in support of the rebels in Boston. And I suppose if we were Virginians, we would know that the House of Burgesses left the State House and they went to a nearby tavern where they continued their deliberations as a Congress. And they called for a convention, a Virginia convention, to meet in August of 1774 to choose delegates to a general Congress. And in anticipation of this, George Mason and George Washington, who are part of the apparatus in Fairfax County, meet at Mount Vernon, and they draft a set of resolves for the Fairfax County Convention to adopt. And the Fairfax resolves are yet another statement of opposition to arbitrary British policies, which violate not our rights as Virginians, but our rights as citizens and as freemen. And among the other points in the Fairfax resolves, they called on general non-importation, and they also called for an end to the slave trade, this wicked, unnatural, and cruel practice as part of their general opposition to British rule. And the Fairfax County does also, the Virginia Convention also chooses delegates to this General Congress. Here in Massachusetts, and I believe Emily will be, these are the Fairfax resolves, I believe Emily will be telling us later about how the Massachusetts Assembly meets in May in Salem, and Governor Gage, suspends the Assembly, not before they choose these delegates to go to a Continental Congress, which will meet in Philadelphia in September. So this is the state of things in the summer of 1774. And the Massachusetts Government Act arrived in Boston on the 6th of August, and this suspends the old council. The old council, as you know, had been appointed or chosen by the Assembly. The governor could veto choices to it. Now that old council is replaced by a bigger council appointed by the governor. no longer elected by the assembly. And the first thing General Gage has to do is find men willing to serve on this new mandamus council. And he has trouble doing that. There's supposed to be 38 members. He only can find 25 men willing to be on it. The first dozen or so are men who live immediately around Boston, and then he gets another dozen who agree to serve, and then those men are put under great pressure is a euphemism. They're forced to resign their positions under intense opposition from their neighbors. Their houses are surrounded. They're threatened sometimes with bodily harm. I don't think it's necessarily for many of them the fear of bodily harm so much as it is seeing their neighbors turning on them. And we could dismiss many of the actions happening in Boston in the 1760s and early 1770s, and certainly the British ministry dismissed them as the actions of a mob. This is why troops had been sent to Boston in 1768 and again now in 1774. But what these counselors see on the outs as these people approaching their homes, wanting them to resign. This is Timothy Bigelow, who is in Worcester County. These are the citizens. These are members of the Board of Selectmen. These are men who have served in the militia or have led the militia. These are their representatives in the general court. These are people of standing who now are telling these individuals who have agreed to serve on the Mandamus Council that they have a choice to make. They can either serve the government of General Gage and the British ministry, or they can continue serving the people of Massachusetts. And what begins happening over the summer of 1774 is that these individuals choose to resign their commission, not accept their commission, and sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes they need to leave town. Actually, the story of a man named Timothy Payne in Worcester. Worcester, is anyone from Worcester? Good. In Worcester, in August of 1774, a county convention meets, and they insist that Timothy Payne, who had agreed to serve on the council, resign. He's one of the wealthiest citizens of Worcester. He's a respected member of the community in Worcester, and suddenly he has 4,000 people surrounding his house demanding his resignation. And he does agree to resign. A committee comes in. Bigelow is on the committee. Other people he knows are on this committee. He agrees he will resign. They go out and they tell the troops gathered outside, he's agreed to resign. They say, that's not enough. We want to hear him resign. So he writes a resignation, and he comes out and he reads it. He had a fairly quiet voice, I guess, and he did not have a sound system as we do today. So they say, we can't hear you. So 4,000 men take turns marching past him as he reads his resignation over and over, apologizing for having agreed to serve on this council, thinking he was only doing his civic duty. These are other counselors who elected to resign. And by the way, General Gage convenes the government, such as it is in Boston. The Massachusetts Government Act had wanted the government to move to Salem, and when General Gage tells the counselors who had agreed to serve that we will be meeting in Salem, they refused to go to Salem because they would be too far from the protection of the British troops in Boston. When Gage hears about the uprising in Worcester, he asks the council if we should send troops out to Worcester, and the council advises him not to do that because they say the uprising is too general. If the troops go to Worcester, the uprising will be happening somewhere else. This is a remarkable turn of events. Back in 1766, when Franklin was hauled before the Parliament to talk about American resistance to the Stamp Act, he was asked about the efficacy of sending troops to put down the rebellion in Massachusetts or in America. And Franklin said that wouldn't work because they won't find a rebellion. There won't be anyone to put down. Now General Gage is told that there is too much of a rebellion for the troops to put down. So sending troops to Worcester would be not only impractical, it would be ineffective. And the Mandamus Council insists we don't want to leave Boston. So Gage has to apologize to the British ministry for not meeting in Salem, as the Government Act said, because the men who had agreed to serve in his government refused to leave the protection of the British forces. But Gage nonetheless, and also on the same day that Gage is trying to assemble a government now in Boston, he does send troops out to Charlestown, a place that is now in Somerville, to collect gunpowder. This seems like a prudent move, actually. My apologies. If the colonists are preparing for war, a prudent move would be to disarm them. And so Gage, on the 1st of September, sends a force up the Mystic River to seize the gunpowder being held at the Powder House in what then was Charlestown, is now Somerville. And the powder alarm is actually effective in getting the powder. It also provokes the next day one of the largest uprisings in the history of Massachusetts. We have Worcester County turning out, and now we have Middlesex County turning out in defense of what Middlesex County insists is stolen gunpowder. On September the 2nd, the crowds gather, actually crowds is the wrong word. These are militia forces from throughout Middlesex County gather on Cambridge Common, preparing to go into Boston to attack the British forces there or otherwise show their displeasure with what happens. Abigail Adams wrote about great apprehension of an immediate rupture. And Joseph Warren talked about the generous spirit of our ancestors seeming to have revived beyond our most sanguine expectations. Of course, Warren isn't on the green in Cambridge thinking about these men who are now going to march into Boston, which is fortified by the British troops. And they are dissuaded from doing this. It happens that Thomas Oliver, no relation to Peter Oliver or Andrew Oliver, is now the lieutenant governor. He lives in Cambridge along Brattle Street, what is now Brattle Street. And he said he had been appointed lieutenant governor without his knowledge. As I said, Hutchinson had been trying to find someone to serve as lieutenant governor. No one agreed to do this, and Oliver had agreed to, not realizing what he was getting himself into, and he took the position without his knowledge, and now suddenly he has hundreds of people surrounding his house. And Oliver wants to prevent a catastrophe. So Oliver, he goes into Boston and meets with General Gage and tells him to stand down. And he says, I will try to get this crowd in Cambridge also not to take hasty action. So Oliver goes back to Cambridge and appeals to the crowd not to march on Boston, which he knows, and probably they know would be disastrous, prevents this crisis from becoming a war in September of 1774. And then along onto the scene come some of our friends, the former customs collectors. And now, of course, we have targets here. And the targets are too appealing to this crowd to resist. These are guys coming back to Cambridge or Roxbury to their homes from being in Salem. And crowds start attacking them, following them into Boston this is in September of 1774. Something is happening here. We're not quite sure where all of this is going to go as we see each side preparing for war but not wanting to start a war in this calamitous year. And then, of course, the war will come, which will be our subject for next year. Now, meanwhile, this is Oliver's house in Cambridge. As I said, the delegates to the Continental Congress had left. Gage had suspended town meetings and meetings of the committees of correspondence, and in September, in September, county conventions are convening. and one happens in Suffolk County. This is the Suffolk Resolves House, and the Suffolk Resolves are like the Fairfax Resolves, a call for colonial unity and non-importation. And the bigger thing happening in Massachusetts actually is when courts are going to convene in October of 1774, the committees of correspondence and the county conventions don't want the courts to meet because the judges will have sworn an oath to the crown, and some of the judges might be collecting salaries. That is, we don't want to be part of this shifting apparatus being created in London. And this is probably the biggest story, the closing of the courts in the different counties of Massachusetts. Worcester County, yet again, turns out. This is the muster roll from the men who had marched to Worcester in October of 1774 to shut off the courts. 500 men from Sutton marched to Worcester to shut down the courts. I don't believe there are 500 men in Sutton today, but here in 1774 they are turning out from all over Worcester County to make sure the courts don't meet. In Barnstable County, the militia from Sandwich actually marches past the home of James Otis Sr., who is the presiding judge of the district court in Barnstable County. They demand his resignation. According to the story, Nathaniel Freeman, the leader of the Sandwich militia, tells Judge Otis the court can't sit, and Judge Otis says, "It is my duty to tell you that you have to disperse." And Freeman says, "You have done your duty, Your Honor. Now we must do ours." These men occupy the court so it can't sit. And similar actions in Taunton, which is the seat of, this is Judge Otis and Nathaniel Freeman, Plymouth. Actually, the Plymouth courthouse was built by Peter Oliver back in a happier day. And the citizens of Plymouth, or the Plymouth militia, take this a step further. This is the occasion when they go down to Plymouth Rock, and they try to haul Plymouth Rock to the front of the courthouse. That is, they're trying to recapture this idea of the founders, this spirit of the ancestors that Joseph Warren was talking about. Unfortunately, the rock splits, and they do get about half of it to the front of the courthouse. And then about 50 years later, they put the rock back together. And folks in Taunton not only shut down the court, this is Bristol County, they come up with a flag of liberty and union. So what we're seeing in Massachusetts is county after county rising, shutting down the courts, taking not law into its own hands, but reasserting their rights under the charter. This is all happening in Massachusetts. And then in October, the provincial Congress meets. At first it met in Salem. That is, General Gage had called them to meet as the assembly in early October. Then at the end of September, he realizes calling together the assembly is a big mistake. He calls it off. About 90 guys go up to Salem to meet as the General Assembly, and they get there. The governor never shows up, and so they reconvene as a provincial Congress the next day in Salem, and then they say, we'll meet next week in Concord, which they do, at the first meeting house in Concord, as well as in Wright's Tavern. And the provincial Congress coming now there are 240 to 260 individuals in this Congress, men who had been elected to the assembly. These were the long-standing leaders in the towns, are now convening as a provincial Congress, which becomes the government of Massachusetts. And they'll continue to meet in Concord until early the next year. Now, meantime, let me just speak briefly about what's happening in Philadelphia. Again, Massachusetts had sent a delegation, but there was a real fear that the other colonies are not going to go along with Massachusetts. Thinking, it's hard for us to imagine, the people in the rest of the colonies even then didn't look to the people of Massachusetts as at the forefront of anything other than being rabid Puritans, sure that they were always right, intolerant of others. So this is a fraught moment. Will the Congress go along with Massachusetts, or will South Carolina, Pennsylvania, and New York say, well, they shut down Boston. We don't want them to shut down Charlestown or Philadelphia or New York. Or you Puritans have finally pushed things too far. And the meeting begins on something of a tense note when someone suggests having prayers. And immediately everyone's eyes turn to this delegation of Puritans from Massachusetts. And Samuel Adams, who is quite an astute politician, says, I think this would be a wonderful idea. And I think that any of the clergy of Philadelphia could do this. In fact, he said, and Philadelphia did have many different denominations. And Adams suggests the Reverend Jacob Duché, who is not only a Philadelphian, he was an Anglican minister. I've heard that Reverend Duché is a fine preacher. And so the Reverend Duché does come and lead the Congress in prayers, and subsequently they have others doing this. It's hard for us perhaps to imagine how important this ecumenical moment was. And reading John Adams's diary, we know that he spent every Sunday usually going to 2 or 3 different meeting houses to see to participate in the worship. Presbyterians, Quakers, Anglicans, Baptists, and even something he couldn't do anywhere else in North America or in British North America, a Catholic meeting house. He's really entranced by the liturgy at St. Mary's Church in Philadelphia, and he wonders how Luther had ever broken the spell of the incense, the music, the chanting. And the Congress, also, it's a chance for these individuals to meet other people they had maybe read about, maybe they had corresponded with, but never actually seen. And some of it is disillusioning. John Dickinson, Adams says, you don't really think he can live another month. He looks so frail. Caesar Rodney, he says, is the strangest looking man in the world. His head is the size of an apple. And yet, some of them, he said, had really good sense, and others were disappointing, like young Ned Rutledge of South Carolina, whom Adams would describe as a peacock. There are other personal notes here going on in Philadelphia, but the important thing is when Paul Revere comes with a Suffolk County resolves, Congress decides they will side with Massachusetts, agree to non-importation, to appease the more conciliatory members of Congress like John Jay and William Duane, the New Yorkers. They also agreed to send a petition to the Crown suggesting that the ministry loosen up and not close the port of Boston, suspend the government, do other things which we in New England called intolerable. A Philadelphia author wrote that he almost wished to hear the triumphs of the Jubilee in the year 1874, to see the medals, pictures, fragments of writings, etc., that shall be displayed to revive the memory of the proceedings of Congress in the year 1774. That is, Congress having met and Congress having stood together now will get the ministry to back down. This, at least, is the high hope of some of those in this memorable year of 1774. One disturbing note for the Massachusetts delegates is this. An unexpected visitor from Massachusetts is the Reverend Isaac Backus, who is a Baptist minister from Middleborough. And he has come to ask Congress how come the Massachusetts Assembly taxes Baptists to support the Congregational Church. Some of the Massachusetts delegates think that Backus is being put up to this by Anglicans and Quakers as a way to divide them. But of course, there's no reason for delegates from any other colony outside of New England to side with this idea of taxing Baptists to support the Congregationalists. The committee with Backus and the Massachusetts delegation meets on a Friday evening. They meet at 8, and they are talking at 11. Robert Treat Payne, one of the Massachusetts delegates, tells Backus that it's not a matter of principle for you Baptists. You just don't want to have to pay taxes. And Backus says, well, that's just what the British ministry says about you. The guys from Massachusetts realize they can't simply dismiss the Baptist plea, so they agree, and Congress suggests that when Backus gets back to Massachusetts, he go talk to the General Assembly about this. And so when Backus, by the way, does lead Congress in prayer one day, much to the consternation of some of the Massachusetts delegates, then he goes back to Massachusetts, and he goes to meet with the Provincial Congress, which I believe now is meeting in Watertown, and he says, Congress said you should stop taxing Baptists. And the Provincial Congress says, no, Congress said you should talk to the Assembly. We're the Provincial Congress, so when the Assembly comes back, you should talk to them. It's hard to believe a legislative body playing these kinds of tricks on anyone like the Reverend Backus. And by the way, Massachusetts finally will stop taxing the Baptists in the 1820s. I guess that is good news, at least for the Baptists. This seems like a congregational audience. So, getting back to what else is happening in 1774, by the way, I have to tell you this. In October of 1774, there was a battle on the Ohio River at a place called Point Pleasant, Virginia. And in 1908, the Congress of the United States designated the Battle of Point Pleasant as the first battle of the American Revolution. It involved Lord Dunmore, the governor of Virginia, and it involved Cornstalk, a leader of the Shawnee, and it involved Red Jacket, a Shawnee war leader, or Blue Jacket, I'm sorry, and Andrew Lewis of the Virginia militia. And it has nothing, it's part of a war between Virginia and the Shawnee to get control of the frontier. It strains at least my imagination to connect it with the American Revolution, but who are we to argue with the Congress of the United States? My real question about this is, at this time, our senior senator had a PhD in history from Harvard University. I wonder, where was Henry Cabot Lodge when Congress was doing this, and where was the rest of our delegation? And I don't know, Jim, if this is going to force us to change our interpretation of what happens in 1775. Are you as shocked as I am at this? Okay. Another thing that happens in the fall of 1774 is a man named Stewart brings a cargo of tea into Annapolis. And his neighbors are so upset, even though he says this is not taxed tea. It's nothing to do with the East India Company. The only way he can appease his restive neighbors is to set the ship on fire. There's actually, this mural is in the Maryland State House showing another tea action. This rebellion, it's against tea, it's against taxes, it's against this idea that someone else can govern us. And what the Americans keep coming back to is an idea of doing this as a way of preserving liberty. And as I said, Josiah Quincy goes to London in the fall of 1774 for somewhat mysterious reasons, but what he finds in London shocks him. He was expecting to find a British public as united and as adamant about American affairs as the Americans were, but he expected the British public to be against what the Americans were doing. Instead, he says, 15 people out of 20 support us. The British public, he says, supports the Americans, not because they hope to dismember the empire, but because they see the cause of America as the cause of liberty. That if Parliament can extinguish liberty in America, they can do it here, and many of them say they are doing it here. So Quincy is quite surprised at the reaction in London to his arrival. He's also somewhat surprised at Franklin, whom some of the Massachusetts radicals thought was too duplicitous. But Franklin, he finds, is a friend of America and more far-seeing than anyone else he meets in London. And Quincy does get to meet with Lord North. He spends about 2 hours talking to Lord North. And Lord North, Quincy says it's difficult because here you have two men who both are used to talking at great length. So the 2 hours must have gone by very quickly for both of them, and wonder who got more than a word in edgewise. He also meets with Lord Dartmouth, the Secretary of State for American Affairs, and he sees on Dartmouth's desk a copy of the observations on the Boston Port Bill. And he also goes to see the king give his speech from the throne opening Parliament in 1774. Quincy and Franklin had both been hoping, working with the British opposition, to rally support for the opposition in the elections of 1774, hoping if the opposition wins, they'll turn out north, change policy toward the Americans. That doesn't happen. And the king opens his speech from the throne talking about those agents who are trying to dismember the empire and stirring up trouble among my subjects. John Lawrence, who was in the audience, thought that when the king was speaking, he seemed to be looking at Josiah Quincy. And Quincy said he was close enough to the king to touch his sword and scepter as he passed. In the House of Lords the following week, in preparing an answer to the king's speech, one member talked about men walking on the streets of London who should be in Newgate, that is, arrested for sedition. And Lord Chatham, the former Prime Minister William Pitt, asks, who are these people? Of course, if there are people like this walking around, they should be arrested. He says, well, I mean Josiah Quincy and Benjamin Franklin, who are walking the streets of London, these two malefactors. So according to Quincy, we have the British public turning very much toward the American cause, while, of course, the British government is adamant on making a statement about the Americans. Back here in New England, as this is happening, the king has sent further instructions to his agents here in America. And in December of 1774, it happens that the Rhode Island Assembly is meeting in Providence when they get news of the king wanting to disarm Americans, and the Rhode Island Assembly then takes the precaution of sending a party down to Newport, they're meeting in Providence, sending a party down to Newport to get the 40-plus guns out of the fort on the island in Newport Harbor, which they do. They act quickly. December 8th, they give the order. By December 10th, they've cleared everything out, and the next day, the frigate Rose arrives from New London to seize any weapons and make sure the rebels, potential rebels, aren't spiriting them away. And they get there, and the arms are all gone. And the commander of the Rose asks the governor of Rhode Island what happened, and he said, well, we wanted to make sure the king or his servants wouldn't get a hold of any of these weapons. Now, while the Rose was out of New London on its way to Newport, the citizens of New London had done a similar thing with the batteries at New London, taking the weapons from those places. And as we're probably aware, in December, parties go to, actually General Gage wants to take the weapons away from the battery in Portsmouth at Fort William and Mary. Paul Revere gets a message there, and those weapons are secured, the fort is secured, before Gage's forces can arrive. And then finally, 1774 ends, as it begins for me at least in London, with Benjamin Franklin. He's actually at the Royal Society, and someone tells him, there's a lady who would like to play chess with you, here is her address. Franklin, of course, was an avid chess player, and he also did not mind dealing with ladies. However, he takes no action on this particular piece of information, and the next week, the same man tells him, there's a lady who would really like to play chess with you. Her name is Catherine Howe. So Franklin goes to Catherine Howe's house to play chess. And this is really a pretext, so Catherine Howe can introduce Franklin to her two brothers, William Howe, who is the commander of, will be the new commander of the British military forces in North America, and Sir Richard Howe, the admiral. And the Howes want to talk to Franklin about what we can do to save the empire. And this is over the course of December of 1774. And in fact, Franklin spends Christmas at Catherine Howe's house in London playing chess and talking about saving the empire. Even though, as I think we can indicate, things here have shifted very much against staying in the empire, there still is hope that perhaps a crisis can be averted. And to find out if that happens or not, come back next year. Thank you all. if anyone has questions, I will be happy to defer to someone who knows the answers.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, everyone, so we get a few minutes, so if you want to use the restrooms, get some coffee, get some water, some snacks, whatever, please do, and then we'll come back with our next session. And also, just a word for I see a number of you sewing, which is wonderful. Please be careful about policing your area. So try not to leave behind pins, needles, bits of thread, things like that. So just be careful about policing your sewing area so that we can leave the place clean. Thank you. See you in a few minutes. Hey, everybody. I thought of a question for Professor Allison. It's kind of a burning question here that we didn't think to ask. So the Battle of Point Pleasant that Congress declared as the first battle of the American Revolution, hey, Bob, did they ever repeal it? We'll get an answer in just a moment. Bob, did they ever repeal the act that declared the Battle of Point Pleasant? No? So it's still on the books. Okay, so I guess now we all have our next campaign. Repeal that and put the proper history in place, Lexington and Concord. And I suppose the Rhode Island delegation will get out of shape. It was the Gaspé, and New Hampshire will get their licks in too, but we'll stick to our guns. Okay, everyone, please take your seats. We're going to get started with our next session. So we've had a lot of really great content so far, and we have more coming up, but this next session is going to be at how we put it together. So our next speaker here comes to us from Gettysburg, though we forgive him, and has finally come over to embrace the age of reason and enlightenment. Everyone, give it up for Jared Foose! Yeah!
Thank you all. So like Jim said, my name is Ranger Jared, again, for those of you who haven't met me. And what I'm going to chat with you all a little bit about here this afternoon is, like Jim said, kind of how we put all of this together. So this is going to be a bit of a theory-heavy presentation, but don't fret. You're going to see a lot of definitions on the screens as I go through this. Don't fret. If anybody wants a copy of the PowerPoints, feel free to reach out to me. I can get you those. But we're basically just going to touch a little bit on, we have all this great knowledge. We have all these great ideas for programs, things like that. How do we put it together? And this is specifically going to be talking about a format that the National Park Service uses in a number of different ways. And I would like to start with just kind of giving an overview. But I want to ask the question first. Who has ever heard education like this being referred to as interpretation? Okay, so most of us. So most of us have heard that phrase, and I see a lot of park rangers over there, hands up in the air. You don't count. But interpretation is defined by the National Park Service. It's really a form of communication. So what we're going to talk about today is how do we communicate big ideas to the public in a way that's going to stick with them and really is going to impact their lives and get them to engage with history on a whole different level. So as we get into the beginning of this presentation, I just wanted to give a really, really quick overview of kind of how the Park Service defines interpretation. And this is a real glimpse behind the scenes of Jim and I's daily lives and all of our park rangers at Minuteman of how we're putting our programs together that we give to the general public. So the National Park Service primarily says that the primary purpose of interpretation is to enrich people's lives through meaningful learning experience. And the Park Service identifies within the concept of interpretation that it has a few key tenets to it, and those being interpretation is investigative, so it should inspire people to investigate history. It's participatory, which means it's not just sage on the stage, somebody up here lecturing at you about history. It's participatory on the audience's side of things too. It's collaborative, which is another aspect, it's just another format of that. And it's also skill-focused. A lot of the programming that we do here, especially the Hive itself is skill-focused, right? We're building lifelong learners. The idea being that we have never learned it all. We're still learning new skills. Myself, I mean, I didn't know how to sew when I came up here from Gettysburg a few years ago, and very fortunately, I have all of you to help and teach me learn how to do that. So thank you. But within interpretation, there is a very long and complex history of how the Park Service kind of came to this point, and I will spare you all that right now, but if you would like recommendations, there's some phenomenal books and some phenomenal scholarly work out there written about kind of the theory and the art behind this. But one of the big kind of widely known names in the National Park Service when it comes to interpretation is this guy named Freeman Tilden. And Tilden is actually a Malden native. He's from Malden, Massachusetts. And he was in the 1950s. And Tilden did this thing where he basically got contracted by the Park Service to tour around the country and go to as many National Park Service sites as he possibly could and other sites outside the Park Service and just see what they did and how they communicated information to the public. And this was not just historical information. this was natural resources, this was talking about astronomy, anything you could possibly imagine that a park ranger might be talking about. How did they do it? And how did it work? So he starts putting together this book of theory about how exactly they're communicating this information and what's the most effective ways to communicate this information. And within this book, he comes up with these 6 principles of what interpretation entails. And the Park Service kind of took this and they said, this is great, and they turned it into their foundations of interpretation. Now, since interpreting our heritage, Tilden's book was written, we've updated this a lot. So the Park Service has pretty much every few years updated our approach to this, but these 6 founding principles of interpretation, Tilden's principles, are still kind of underlying all of that. So I just wanted to take a really brief moment to touch on some of those because I think they're going to be really relevant to all of us, especially if you're a guide with Michelle and you're out there on the line talking to people about April 19th of 1775. And I'll just very briefly read these principles. Number 1, Tilden says, interpretation that does not somehow relate what is being displayed or described to something within the personality or the experience of the visitor will be sterile. Interpretation should be personal to the audience. That basically means know your audience, and we're going to get into that a little bit more in this presentation, but the concept being know who you're talking to. You can't be talking to a 10-year-old the same way you're talking to an adult about something super complex political situation in 1774, right? Number 2, information as such is not interpretation. Interpretation is relevation based upon information. Successful interpretation must do more than present facts. So interpretation is not just strictly facts, right? It's all the other stuff that comes along with that. And if you've ever had a history teacher in school, right? Some people I hear like, oh, I found history so boring when I was in school. And then you start asking them why, and they start saying, well, all we did was we learned dates and names, and that was it. Well, that's just factual information. That's not the emotion behind it, which is where interpretation kind of comes into play here. Number 3, interpretation is an art which combines many arts, and any art in some degree is teachable. And I feel like there's no better place to point this out than at the Hive as I'm looking around and seeing everybody working on these incredible, really art pieces, right? Material culture, we're making things. That's an art, that's a skill. Interpretation can combine that, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. Number 4, the chief aim of interpretation is not simply instruction, but provocation. We're trying to get people to ask questions. We want them to question the information they're getting. We want them to tie that to their lives in the moment. So we're provoking them to think deeper about these things. So to harken back to Jim and I's presentation a little bit ago about our interpretive themes that we're going to use for the 250th, those essential questions, that's a way that we provoke people to think deeper, because essential questions in the National Park Service are questions that are generally unanswerable via a simple yes or no, right? That's something you really have to think hard about, and that's what interpretation is getting at. Number 5, interpretation should aim to present a whole rather than a part. So again, the intent being is that we are telling a whole story, a holistic story that's inclusive of a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different elements, and not just little tiny pieces of factual information. There's a lot going on with how we present this information. So it means you have to really think about how are you going to talk about these certain topics and subjects. And number 6, interpretation addressed to children should not be a dilution of presentations to adults, but should follow a fundamentally different approach. Different age groups have different needs requiring different interpretive programs. So again, that idea of please don't be out there telling a 10-year-old about all the intricate details of the Magna Carta, because chances are it's going to go right over their head. But there are ways that you can engage them on those levels in different kind of formats. And that's what we're going to get into now, is a type of interpretation that the Park Service also has talked about in the past that you all are very familiar with already, even if you don't know what it is. And that type of interpretation is informal interpretation. So what is informal interpretation and what is an informal visitor contact? Well, the National Park Service, again, defines an informal visitor contact as an encounter between a visitor and an interpreter during which the progression is based on the visitor's needs and responses. So for us all, how many of us have been at an event, you're just standing around, and suddenly a member of the public walks up to you and asks you a question? All of us. That's an informal conversation, right? And when that person asked you the question, did you turn around and start telling them something that had absolutely nothing to do with the question that they just asked? No, right? Because that's not how we engage with the general public. That's not how we engage with people in life. What we're doing is engaging at their level. They've asked a question, we're engaging on what they already know or the question that they're bringing to us. And that's kind of going to hold true throughout all of interpretation, but especially informal contacts, is you're letting the public guide where you're going in the conversation. You may have some talking points that you start with, that you have ideas, so that sometimes, you know, when you come up to somebody and you say, oh, do you have any questions? And they say, I don't know. And you get that deer in the headlight look. If you have things prepared already, there are ways you can encourage people, you can provoke them to then launch into their own questions. But again, the whole point of this isn't that you're just standing there giving them a fire hose of information about everything you've ever learned about April 19th of 1775, right? Because chances are they're not going to remember any of it. So then, with that in mind, where does informal interpretation happen at? And this is an open question. Anybody want to shout out an answer? Where do you do informal interpretation at? Anywhere, right? Literally anywhere. For when we do this presentation for our seasonal rangers, I tell them most of the interpretation you are going to do in your career in the National Park Service is going to be informal contacts. This is outside the visitor center, inside the visitor center, in the parking lot, in the line for the bathroom, right? Anywhere you could engage with the public, chances are you're probably going to end up doing informal interpretation there. Now, the other side of this spectrum, why I keep saying informal interpretation, is that there's also formal interpretation. Structured programs like this, right, where you have a whole structure to how you're going to present the information already thought out in your head, and you can just go off for 20, 30 minutes in a structured program format. That's a whole different topic. If anybody wants to learn about that, I'd be more than happy to talk sometime, not right now, because right now we're just talking about what happens when somebody walks up to you. So, within interpretation, I'll let everybody get a good chuckle off of this one. Yes, Jim says a dystopian vision. You can see Paul cringing someplace. But within interpretation, the National Park Service used to have all these massive acronyms and ways to describe this. They use various descriptors to kind of get that theory put down on paper, but again, I almost guarantee that most of you are doing this already. And this might look complex, but this is something called the interpretive equation that the National Park Service used to use. And basically what it is saying is that you have somebody, your interpreter, you yourself, with knowledge of the resource, right? In National Park Service, we define a resource as really anything that we could talk about. So for you all, the resource is Battle Road or material culture or whatever specific topic you're interested in, right? So you have a knowledge of that resource already. It's deep down in there. You also have a knowledge of the audience that you're going to add to that knowledge of the resource. So that is really important in informal interpretation, is being able to tell what somebody is looking for when they walk up to you, right? So if they come up asking where the bathroom is, they don't need to get fire hose of information about the North Bridge. Probably a bad idea, because they're not going to listen to anything that you're saying, because they're looking for the bathroom, right? Works the same way with information as well about interpretive subjects. So you know your audience, you know what they're looking for, you also know what might be the most appropriate level of content to give them. The way you talk to one of us is not going to be the same way you talk to somebody who has never ever heard of the American Revolution before, right? Knowing your audience, key. If you combine your knowledge of your resource and the knowledge of your audience, and then you multiply it by the appropriate technique, which we're going to get to in a second. So choosing what's going to be the best way to deliver this information, you're going to get an interpretive opportunity out of that. And an interpretive opportunity is basically going to mean you're going to impact that person so much that, number one, they're going to remember it, and it's going to change something about them. In the Park Service, we often say it's through interpretation that we get stewardship, right? People aren't going to come and work with us at the park. They're not going to want to work with us at the park. They're not going to want to do these things if they don't already have a basis of understanding of why are these things important in the first place. So interpretation really is giving the tools for the audience member to decide this is an important topic that I should know about, that I should care about, and I should do something about. Right? And again, the Hive is a really great example of that. All of us getting together saying, hey, these topics, these things, the material culture that we have displayed in the back, these are all important. We should talk about these things because we have had those interpretive opportunities. We've had those interpretive experiences that guided us into stewardship. So now we take that concept, that big theory, and we apply it on the individual level to what's actually going to happen in the field when you're out there talking to people, or when you're at a reenactment or an event and the public comes into the camp and they start engaging with you. So informal interpretation is going to be, again, based on some really big level theories that you're all already doing, but it's sometimes relevant and insightful to point those out. One of the primary, most important aspects of informal interpretation is quality customer service. And that basically just means being a positive experience for that person in general, for the most part, right? Again, if somebody comes up to you asking where's the bathroom at, you're gonna tell them where the bathroom's at, not fire hose them with information about Hartwell Tavern. Quality customer service cannot be overstated enough. How important this is to getting visitors to engage with the content that you have the knowledge of and that you're ready to present to them by meeting them at their level. So quality customer service is so critical to all of this. The next part of that is also assessing visitor needs, which goes right into the same example of assessing a visitor's need. I need to use the bathroom. Okay, you should probably do that first before I start telling you about Hartwell Tavern, sort of things. Knowing your site, the location that you're at, and again, Michelle has done a wonderful job with the guides, and we've done all of these great sessions leading up to Battle Road this year about knowing the site, how we talk about the site, what people are going to see if you're standing along the rope lines. All those things combine together to give the appropriate amount of information. And then, like I said, also selecting the appropriate technique. So let's dive a little bit deeper into those. Actually, I'll go back and I'll save that one for a second. So things to think about when we talk about quality customer service. First of all, being friendly, right? Something as small as a smile can really make a difference in an entire situation. And some of you who are going to be present for our Battle Road boot camps and some other things like that, we're going to do some de-escalatory training for people of what happens when you get a visitor who is approaching you with not a smile, who is upset about something, right? And one of the things that we talk about for our rangers, if you're in a situation where somebody is upset, sometimes just being a happy person will change their entire demeanor. And they immediately go from, I'm angry about this thing, to, oh, okay, you're just a person and we can have a conversation about this and I don't need to scream at you for whatever reason, right? So being friendly. The big one for me, and this applies, I think, to everybody as well, is be the person, the ranger or the reenactor that you would want to engage with. Who's the person that you would want to talk to? Be that person, right? So if you would like to be able to have a friendly disposition with people, again, chances are your visitors are also going to want those things. Also remember that sometimes visitors are going to ask the same questions over and over and over and over and over. Just because you've been asked, were people short back then because the ceilings in this house are so low for the 10,000th time that day, doesn't mean that that visitor has ever heard that before, right? So it might be your 100th time hearing this question, but it's their first time hearing the answer. And how you respond to that makes all of the difference in the world of how they're then going to engage afterwards with the content, with the site. And I've seen this happen in real time where somebody's asked a question for the 10,000th time and the answer that is given maybe isn't the nicest way of phrasing that answer, and then suddenly that visitor shuts down. And they disengage and they don't want to have anything else to do with the site, with the story, with the people around because of that singular, very quick moment. So again, just because they're asking you the question for the 100th time doesn't mean that they've heard the answer ever before. And then something else to consider, the last thing I've written down here is that just remember, you may be the reason that somebody decides that they want to get involved. Whether that's recruiting for the groups that you are participants in, whether that's recruiting for the National Park Service, for volunteering opportunities. People really, we're on a stage, right? People see us, and how we engage with them is going to influence how they engage with us and how they engage with the site. So you could be the person that convinces them, hey, I want to go become a volunteer, or hey, I want to become a reenactor. I want to learn about these things. So again, all this feeds into that idea of quality customer service. How are you engaging them in a positive way that is going to positively influence their outlook on this? So number 2 that we talked about there, right, is assessing visitor needs. Assessing visitor needs, again, also critical. And some of the big things that maybe we do already but don't necessarily think constantly about, and I talk about this with our rangers quite a bit, are things like reading body language, right? Has anybody ever had one of those situations where you can look at somebody as they're approaching you and say, I know the mood that you are in already before you are even getting up to me, right? What are some body language things that you might pick up on as an interpreter that would give you a hint of how that visitor is feeling? I see people doing it, right? Arms crossed, right? If you see somebody that's got their arms crossed and they're closing themselves off and they're doing this, what's that probably telling you? They don't care, or they're upset about something, right? Not a positive emotion that's going on right there. Reading body language is really important. One of the big ones we talk about with our rangers, what happens if you see you're talking with a visitor and you see the visitor doing this? Do you follow them? No. And I have seen this happen at other National Park Service sites where the ranger is following somebody to their car in the parking lot. Oh, I forgot to tell you this thing about... No, right? Reading body language, being able to tell when somebody's had enough, they've had enough. And if you just keep fire hosing them with information, they're not going to retain any of that, and chances are they're probably also going to have a pretty negative view about the experience that they just had of like, oh, I remember that one time that ranger followed me to my car at Hartwell Tavern. And they stood outside the window and continued telling me about Samuel Hartwell. I didn't care, right? Reading body language is so critical. And there are a lot of different examples of this, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here, right? You've all seen this at events. You've all seen this, and you've also seen your colleagues do this, right? How many times have you been in an event where somebody is getting fire hosed of information and everybody kind of looks around and go, ooh, uh-oh, they got caught by Jim, right? Yeah, you're in my view. So just be mindful of that. Reading body language is a really key aspect of assessing visitor needs. But also, what's another way that you can assess visitor needs? Probably the easiest one. Ask them, right? Or let them tell you. Let them tell you what their needs are. Because again, chances are they're going to come pre-primed with information or an idea of what they want to talk to you about. And again, we're going to get into it in a second. There are ways that you can encourage them to come up with their own information, but you don't necessarily, again, need to fire hose them with that information because information, again, is not interpretation. So now we'll move on to knowing your site and your content, which again, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir because we all kind of have that understanding, right? A really deep, complex understanding of the content, the things that we're talking about is so critical. And I think the one thing I'll say about this, and something I've discovered in my rather short, comparatively, National Park Service career working with the public on a day-to-day basis, is that if somebody asks you a question you don't know the answer to, it's okay to say, I don't know. It's better to say, I don't know, than to make something up. Because making something up is probably going to do more damage to their view of whatever this content is. How many of you ever heard that phrase, the lies my docent told me? All right? That's a fairly, in the museum world, that gets passed around a lot, right? The idea being is, I don't know, so I'm just going to come up with some theory off the top of my head that may explain it, but oftentimes those theories are wrong, right? Sometimes we have educated guesses, but it's critical to be authentic with your visitors, right? To be right there, level with them and say, you know, truly, I don't know the answer to that, but there's always a way to find that information. And that's the critical portion of this. If you say, I don't know, however, Henry might know about how that garment was constructed, or this person might know, or this book might tell you that information. There are always ways to recommend, here's where you can learn more. I don't have that answer, and that's okay. But so long as you give them a way that maybe they can go further pursue that knowledge, that's a critical element of all of this, is that you're meeting them where they're at, and you're getting them to the place that they want to be for learning that information. So with all of those in mind, we'll move down to something the Park Service calls the interpretive curriculum. And we've kind of put in practice, Jim and I joke around about this frequently, the idea of where, what, and why, right? You have orientation, that's information about where. So when you're engaging with the public, you're giving them basic overview. You start with this. You're at Hartwell Tavern, you're at XYZ. Information is what? Here's the content of what I'm talking about. Interpretation is the why. It invokes appropriate techniques to move beyond information and develop links between the resources that we're talking about and intangible concepts or big theory ideas, right? Provides visitors with an opportunity to form their own intellectual and or emotional connections to those things. So there are a few different ways. I will also point out that visitors, when they're engaging with you, must be allowed to progress individually on this interpretive continuum, right? You can't force them how to move through to interpretation, or you can't say, you have to care about this thing because I said so. Chances are, if you tell somebody you need to care about it because I said it's important, they're not going to care about it in the way that you care about it. You have to let them build that connection themselves. They have to care about it because they truly find it interesting or engage with it in some form or fashion, right? Got to let them build the emotional value to it. But when we do this, there are different techniques, different ways that we can engage the public when we're out at events, when we're at Battle Road, or wherever it may be. And those two major ways are passive techniques and active techniques. And those are exactly what you would imagine they sound like, right? A passive technique is something where you're not necessarily doing anything, and the visitor is going to come up to you and engage on their own terms, right? So somebody comes up to you and asks you a question or something like that. And there are ways to facilitate this, and one of the ones that we point out here in the slide is just making yourself open and accessible to people, right? Saying, hey, if anybody has any questions, feel free to come up and ask. You're more than welcome, or just walk around inside the house, whatever that may be. Letting yourself just be there for them to then engage with you on their own terms. That's a passive technique. Now, an active technique is one where you approach the visitor. And this is what I was talking about earlier, is that there are a few ways that you could do that that is going to allow the visitor to still progress through their own interpretive experience on their own terms. At Gettysburg, one of the things that we would do frequently is that we would have different little bits of material culture, right? Whether that's a coat or a gun or a sock with a Confederate flag on the heel of it, so we could talk about traitors and secessionists in the Civil War, right? The whole point being is that you have something that's going to provoke those people into asking a question. So setting yourself up to provoke people to ask those questions. And this works really well in a living history format because we often ourselves are the thing that's going to provoke people into asking questions. Because just somebody might walk up to you and say, hey, how many stitches does it take to put that dress together? Well, that's a very technical answer, right? You may not have the answer, but that opens a doorway that you can then use to engage on other concepts, other topics. Well, yeah, okay, so maybe this many stitches estimate, but did you know in 1775, like, they're getting their materials from X place and Y place, right? There are other ways to get deeper into the topic, but you're allowing those people to guide that themselves through their own interests. And the last big thing that I'll kind of touch on here, something that's, again, really important with visitors when you're engaging with them in an informal context, is read social cues. Again, if you see somebody backing away from you, it means that they're probably done with that conversation. If you see somebody who's nodding along and they're intently focused and engaging with you, chances are you've got them hooked, right? Or if they're asking questions. And I often tell our rangers that if your visitors aren't asking questions throughout the course of your talking with them, you should stop at some point in time and ask yourself why. And oftentimes it's because we're not giving them the opportunity to ask questions. You might think that you're giving them the opportunity to ask questions, but instead really what's happening is that you're fire hosing them with that information and you haven't stopped talking for 20 minutes. Right? And they haven't had a chance to ask a question. So just pausing every once in a while, using those social cues to say, oh, I'm going to stop at the end of this phrase, and I'm going to let them guide the question. So if the visitors aren't talking back to you in the middle of one of these engagements, chances are something is not right about how that engagement is going on. So keep that in mind as you're progressing out there through the parks, through your reenactment communities, things like that. It's just being able to pick up on those little cues from the people you're talking to about how the conversation is going and how you can get them involved in the conversation, because that is the key element here, is that they are engaging on their own terms. And I'll just leave up this last slide here as I ask some questions of some great pictures from Battle Road this year. And I encourage you all to take a look at these pictures, and especially for those of you that might be guides this year, and think about how would I engage the public standing in front of me along the rope line who are seeing these scenes behind me? What's an effective way that I can get the public hooked into the story, into the narrative, without fire hosing them with information and without pushing them away from the story that we're trying to convey and what we're trying to tell? So as we wrap up here, I'll say if anybody has any questions, feel free to come up and ask me questions later at another time, whatever it may be. I know that we're running on a little bit of a tight schedule right now, but I will say thank you all for listening to our very short overview of informal interpretation.
Okay, how's everybody doing? All right. Woo, all right, we're gonna keep going here. So our next speaker here, this is gonna dovetail very nicely with Professor Allison's presentation about the year 1774, and he alluded to the legislature moving to Salem that summer. And so Dr. Emily Murphy, who is the historian and curator at Salem Maritime National Historic Site and Saugus Ironworks National Historic Site. She's been studying this topic for a long time. Her dissertation was on the Darby family of Salem. She also published a history of the 2nd Corps of Cadets, 101st Field Artillery Veterans Association, and numerous other articles. And of course, she is my own dear wife. So, Emily Murphy.
Okay. Can folks hear me all right? Sweet. Okay. So, as a promotion for our upcoming encampment weekend in Salem, at Salem Maritime National Historic Site, on June 15th and 16th. Oh, commemorating, I'll put the notes here and wear my glasses. Commemorating actually, you know what, honey, could you give me the pink thing there? I need my other glasses. Age is no fun. So anyway, we're doing an encampment in Salem on June 15th and 16th, and it is to commemorate the 250th anniversary of General Thomas Gage moving the legislature and capital to Salem. And this happened in June of 1774. You can actually see this is the closest we have to what Salem looked like at the time. This is actually a drawing that was done from the second floor of the townhouse. And if you are at all familiar with Salem, you are looking up Washington Street to the top of the hill there where the T station is. None of those buildings still stand that you see in that picture. So Professor Allison has already taken us on a whirlwind tour of the larger picture of the extremely difficult year of 1774. So I'm going to do some microhistory. I'm going to talk about how this affected Salem and what was going on in Salem at the time. So in order to do this, I'm going to begin with an examination of two sources that give us an idea of who was living in Salem at the time. So the first is the Massachusetts Census of 1764, which I found at the Phillips Library of the Peabody Essex Museum. Unfortunately, all that remain are the summaries for the towns in Massachusetts, not the actual lists that give you the names of the people. But there are some interesting conclusions to draw from here. So I pulled the numbers from Salem, Marblehead, and Boston for comparison. First, the number of houses versus the number of families. On average, they're saying it looks like about 2 families per house. Now, since I know there were a lot of single families living in homes in Salem at the time, it means there must have been some pretty packed houses in these towns. And this is where having the schedule would have been really helpful, because it would be helpful to know how they're defining family units living within a house. It's also helpful here to be reminded that at this time, Salem and Marblehead were just over a quarter of the size of Boston, which is another reason Gage might have wanted to move to Salem. Smaller population, easier to control, everybody knew each other, less likely to have the type of mob violence that they're seeing in Boston. Now the other source is the Massachusetts tax evaluation of 1771. Which a professor at Harvard University very kindly turned into a database for us. Now, when you look at this source in comparison with the census of 1764, it's actually really interesting. But this source comes with some real caveats. So I pulled the original legislation that created the tax, and this is by no means a census. It's supposed to be for males aged 16 and up, although we will see later on that there are quite a few women listed here. And if you're looking to see what someone owned, the value is based on the annual rent of the property they own, like dwelling houses, shops, warehouses, and businesses, not their sale price. Vessels only count if they're over 10 tons in burthen. And likewise, young animals don't count. So oxen below the age of 4, horses and cows below the age of 3. Most importantly, servants for life, as enslaved peoples are termed here, only count if they are between 14 and 45. And we will get to that a little bit later. What I find kind of interesting here is also the standard of living for Salem. Accounting for a little bit of growth in 6 years, it means that almost all the males over 16 have enough money to be taxed, while in Boston and Marblehead, that number is lower. So there are more people living closer to poverty in Boston and Marblehead. So let's begin with the men, as you have to do in the 18th century because they controlled the political and economic landscape. So in order to participate in town affairs as a voter, a citizen of mid-18th century Salem had to be male, 21 years old, an inhabitant of the town for the past year, own at least 20 pounds worth of property, and pay his poll taxes. One of the ways we can get a good idea of who is jockeying for position in the town in 1774 is to look at two addresses to General Gage upon his arrival in Salem. And these two addresses really kind of split neatly along the Friends of Government and the Friends of Liberty, or the Tories and the Patriots. And they're really a predictor of who's going to end up being labeled a Tory and very likely have to flee Salem in 1775. Both were published in the Essex Gazette with the names of the signers, and I'm indebted to Professor Richard Morris of Lycoming College, who published an exhaustive analysis of the signers of the two addresses. So the first address from the Friends of Government is addressed to His Excellency Thomas Gage, Governor and Commander-in-Chief of the province of Massachusetts Bay, and goes on to say that we are deeply sensible of His Majesty's paternal care and affection to the province. Continuing, we rejoice that this town is graciously distinguished for that spirit of loyalty and reverence for the laws, which is equally our glory and happiness. And they finish up with, and we assure your excellency we will make it our constant endeavors by peace, good order, and a regard for the laws as far as in us lies, to render your station and residence easy and happy. The rest of Salem did not agree. The second address is to His Excellency Thomas Gage, Captain General and Commander-in-Chief in and over His Majesty's province of Massachusetts Bay. You can already see this is heading downhill. They begin with the usual, we look forward to working with you, and then just go straight to the heart of the matter, the Boston Port Bill, saying, we hope your excellency will use your endeavors to prevent a further accumulation of evils on that already sorely distressed people. They then point out that although shutting the port of Boston might be thought to be an advantage to Salem, the harbor would not allow it. Salem Harbor is really shallow and very difficult to maneuver if you don't know it very well, which people owning several million-dollar yachts find out every summer. And Boston was a major market for Salem's imports, particularly those from the Caribbean. They then start to get a little bit threatening, saying that they were, quote, foremost in loyalty, and their fathers, quote, fled from oppression, braved every danger, and by their astonishing efforts greatly facilitated the settlement of the other British colonies in America. Yet, sir, we speak it with grief. The sons are checked and dishonored for exhibiting proofs of their inheriting some portion of that spirit, which in their fathers produced such astonishing effects. They then go on to say that, quote, a happy union with Great Britain is the wish of all the colonies, and every measure compatible with the dignity and safety of British subjects we shall gladly adopt. They finish with a wish that I am totally going to borrow, that his administration be, quote, as easy as the nature of things will possibly admit. As you can imagine, Gage was very, very pleased with that first address and rather displeased with the second. But it's the list of the signers that gives us a real insight into society at the time. So let's start with the Friends of Government. So Salem, for many, many years, had been run by the interlinked Brown, Turner, Linde, Lindell, and Orne families. There will be a quiz at the end of this, who were tied by marriage to Governor Thomas Hutchinson and his brother-in-law, Andrew Oliver. The Olivers actually owned property in Salem. So 29 of the 48 loyal signers were part of this clan. And interestingly, most of the rest of them were actually physically pretty close to these folks. So most of the people in Salem live, or most of the loyal signers in Salem, do I have a, I do. They live along what's now known as Essex Street. Was then, this area of it was known as King Street at that time. This is the main street. And then this is now known as Washington Street. And so you've got the Kerwins, you've got Timothy Orne living here, and Dr. John Prince, who's one of the loyal signers, not related to the Olivers, is actually living across the street from Timothy Orne, as one example. Dr. Philip Cast is also living right along this street as well. And interestingly, because as Bob pointed out, you know, there's this splits families. Dr. John Prince was the son-in-law of Captain Richard Derby Sr., who was the head of one of the leading Patriot families in Salem. So most of these folks were living on inherited wealth. They were diversified in real estate and shipping, but Professor Morris only identifies one person who had been an active ship captain. Most of the rest of them were investing in shipping, but were not actually, could not actually sail a vessel. Others, like Dr. John Prince, who I just mentioned, had other occupations, such as a physician or lawyer or apothecary, and had branched into shipping to make extra money. Many of these people also relied on appointed offices like justices or customs officials, and until 1768, they also held all the elected offices in Salem. 40% were members of St. Peter's Church, the Anglican church in town, and they were 10 times more likely to have been to Harvard than the signers of the Patriot Address. They were losing control of Salem, but they hadn't completely lost it yet. In 1773 and 4, a good representation of them held prestigious town offices such as selectman, overseer of the poor, clerk of the market, school committee, and overseer of the laws regarding shad and alewives. In the hierarchical society of the 18th century, they would have demanded and gotten respect. 125 residents signed the second address. As with the other addresses, it was also family-based. Repeated last names are on here, so you see groups from families signing, but then you also have these two sort of leading interlinked family sets. So you got the Derby, Crown and Shield, Hodges crowd, and then you have the Pickering, Dodge, Williams crowd. These folks are actually also interrelated because everybody is married into the Gardner family. All the Gardners had 13 children. They were all named John or Jonathan. It's very difficult to figure out who's who. Even contemporaneously, there are people, there's a couple of letters where people are like, my brother's coming home. Oh, no, wait, that was my cousin. So the leaders of these two families, politically, were Richard Derby Jr., oldest son of the Derby family, and he was one of two representatives to the General Court from Salem. He was active in the Patriot cause, and then Timothy Pickering Jr., who would later be in Washington's cabinet. Again, I really do have to point out Richard Morris and probably his students for doing some really exhaustive research on the signers. He identifies 50.4% of these folks as artisans. They're silversmiths like John Andrew and William Northey, wheelwright, James Gould, painter, Samuel Blythe, although Blythe is really interesting because he not only paints General Gage's pew in St. Peter's Church, he's also the organist for St. Peter's Church, but here he is signing the Patriot cause. 29.3% were current or recently retired active mariners, and that includes Richard Derby Jr., George Crowninshield, and Edward Allen. So in contrast to the merchants on the Loyalist address, who really focused on trade with England, their advertisements say that they're bringing in the latest English and India goods, so they're pulling stuff from the East India Company. These guys are trading anywhere in the Atlantic Basin they can make a profit. So they're heavily reliant on the West Indies, Madeira, Cadiz, places like that, as well as England. And so this two group of people are very much the sort of heart of the patriot cause. They're the ones who are really going to be affected by a lot of this taxation, a lot of the other laws that have come into effect in the 1760s and the 1770s, and this is where a lot of the agitation about representation is coming from. So let's move on to the women of Salem. You'll notice that in 1764, the number of adult women exceeds the adult men, as is to be expected in a port community where the substantial number of men are at sea and widows are far too common. In the 1771 tax valuation, however, I found 65 women mentioned. And this is interesting because in the 18th century, women were generally, the legal term was femme covert, so their property belonged to either their husband or their father. 11 of these women were identified as widows, and a few of them were identified as wards. So these are underage girls who had just inherited money from their father's estate. But there are a couple of these folks who are identifiable as businesswomen. Of course, it does help if you're related to several successful mercantile families, as Abigail Pickman Eppes was. Her father was Benjamin Pickman, one of the most successful merchants in Salem. Excuse me. And she was married to another successful merchant, William Epps. And we first meet Abigail in the public record when she's settling her husband's estate. In the late 1760s, she then takes her inheritance and settles into keeping a successful shop. However, she ran afoul of the non-importation agreements. Along with 3 other shopkeepers in 1770, she got the sheriff to open her warehouses where the goods were stored and retrieved them. The town meeting strongly objected and passed a resolution that their infamy be published in the paper once a month for a year and read before the annual town meeting for 7 years. In addition, citizens of the town agreed not to buy anything from them for a year after the importation restrictions were lifted. People have short memories, though, and within 7 months, Abigail was advertising goods. In May of 1772, she married the wealthy and successful Dr. Sylvester Gardner, but she, or more likely someone she hired, continued to operate the shop for at least another year. Notice here she is the late Mrs. Eppes, because she was remarried, not dead, but she had a good brand, so she wanted to keep it. The Gardners were loyalists. They fled to England in 1775, and Abigail died there in 1780. Priscilla Manning is a really interesting one. She is born in Ipswich. Not much is known about how she made her way to Salem, but by 1769, she has a substantial stocks of fabrics and millinery goods in her shops. She disappears from the record in 1773 when she marries George Abbott, and this is a literal femme covert situation. It's same ad, same shop, just his name on it. But you better bet she was actually running the shop, because the minute he kicks off in 1788, she's advertising the shop under her name again. Another pair of shopkeepers who are probably getting their start right now were Mary and Sarah Hawthorne. And I found them when I was looking at records of Revolutionary War privateers, the auctions of privateer goods. And they were buying huge amounts of stuff. And so I started doing some research, and I discovered that in the years after the Revolution, Mary particularly becomes a very successful merchant. She's owning ships in her own right, and dies with an estate worth over $30,000 in 1804, which is a good chunk of change. So they were getting started at this point. They had to have been to have that kind of money by the late 1770s, but they are probably under their father's name because he was still alive at this point. We catch a few glimpses of other women in the papers in 1773 and 74 pursuing more traditional avenues open for women. That's an ad for the Hawthorns. So Mary Bass informed the ladies of Salem that she had moved. You really want to know where your midwife actually is when you need her. And Elizabeth Gauden begged leave to inform the ladies that she had a school where she would teach young ladies plain sewing, marking, tent, and Irish stitch, as well as take misses to board. Salem also had a noticeable population of people of African descent. you will notice a big discrepancy between the numbers recorded on the 1764 census and the numbers on the 1771 tax valuation. There are half as many servants for life recorded in 1771. One reason for this is that the tax valuation is only for enslaved people ages 14 to 45. And as many historians have pointed out, enslavers in New England preferred younger people. The valuation will also miss any older enslaved peoples in households. We're slowly finding the names of the enslaved people in Salem, such as Phyllis, who is the maid to Richard Derby Sr.'s second wife, or Obed, who ran away from Richard Derby's household in March of 1773, or Rose and Isaac, who were enslaved by Elias Darby and his wife when the family lived in the Derby house, which is now at Salem Maritime. Some, however, we only know by their skills, like this enslaved blacksmith and hairdresser who appear in these advertisements in the Essex Gazette. However, another reason that there's that discrepancy is that there is a growing free black community in Salem. One example is Isaac Hauer, who is enslaved by Samuel Gardner, but freed in his will in 1769. By 1770, Hauer is actually purchasing his own home and plot of land in the Southfields area of Salem, on the highway to Marblehead. So that's basically down around where Salem State is now. After the war, Howard became actually a successful small businessman, and he was actually lending money to members of the black community in Essex County. And his estate in 1788 was valued at about $2,200. So that's a little picture of who's in Salem. Now, what are they talking about? So in the first part of 1774, you'd think all this other stuff that was going on that Bob Allison was talking about would be all over the newspapers. In fact, there's two matters of local importance taking up a lot of space in early 1774. The first and smaller one was a dispute between Dr. Nathaniel Whitaker, the minister at what's now known as the Tabernacle Church, and the church administration about Dr. Whitaker purchasing the parsonage. There seems to have been a lot of tension, and it blew up into lengthy vitriolic letters between Whitaker and his parishioners, published in the newspapers, accusing each other of reneging on deals, hiding and stealing signed paperwork, lying to each other. And then Timothy Pickering decided to get into it and debate Whitaker about his style of preaching. By this point, they are actually publishing supplements to the Essex Gazette to contain all of these letters. And at one point, Dr. Whitaker refuses to pay for the supplement, so the opposition pays for his stuff to get printed so that they can continue responding to it. And at the same time, Pickering is also getting involved in a newspaper war related to smallpox inoculation, just in case you think public health and politics is a new thing. A single case of smallpox was enough to throw town selectmen all over the colony into a panic. But by the 1760s, inoculation was becoming more acceptable to the general population. But it was a tough road, because people had a very legitimate fear that somebody who was suffering from the lighter form of smallpox caught from inoculation in the hospital could then transmit it to others in the natural way, as they called it, and start an epidemic where there had been none. And also, the treatment was expensive, and the doctors who ran these private hospitals could drive up the price. So in the summer of '73, one of these smallpox epidemics hit the North Shore. Marblehead was the first nearby town to be badly affected, and in August of '73, a group of prominent Marbleheaders proposed to build an inoculation hospital on Cat Island in Salem Harbor. This one became so controversial that the citizens of Marblehead actually burned it down a few months later. Shortly thereafter, the disease was discovered in Salem. So quarantine was the first line of defense, and then the next step was to establish a hospital. But even before the ground was broken for the hospital, controversy began to swirl around the choice of physician to perform the inoculations. And again, this is going to offer us an insight into these greater issues of national identity and rights that Bob was talking about on the larger stage. So there was a highly accomplished inoculator working in Marblehead, but the Salem Hospital overseers chose Dr. James Latham to be their inoculator. And Latham was an adherent of what was called the Suttonian method. The Suttons were a family in Britain who had created, who developed their own proprietorial inoculation techniques and medicines, and they were basically franchising. So Latham was a franchisee. And he starts putting ads in the Essex Gazette to sort of pave the way and say, I've been successful doing all these inoculations. And almost immediately, someone writes another letter to the newspaper over the signature Marblehead. And he attacks Latham and the Suttons for their method of inoculation. Latham well knows, writes Marblehead, that his method, excepting some trifling variety in the manner of making the incision, is the same which has long been in use in America, and that he has never had greater success in inoculating than our own physicians of note and experience. It ought to therefore be called the American, not the Suttonian method of inoculation. Here, it is intolerable that men should make a mystery of an art and endeavor to enrich themselves by it in the very country where that art was first discovered and practiced with unequaled success. Americans, arouse and resent such insults offered to your understandings. And there's further attacks in the next issues. And this exchange is very typical of those in the Boston area newspapers, where you get local controversies that immediately jump to these questions of liberty and rights. So basically, within a few letters, you've got folks arguing that Britain is corrupt, idle, and full of iniquity, and therefore they had taken this American method, brought it over to England, corrupted it, and then they were making us pay more for it than we would if we'd just gone with the American folks initially. So at first, Timothy Pickering Jr., who is, man, he's a letter writer to be proud of. So at first, he's defending Latham, mainly because one of the people attacking Latham is Dr. Nathaniel Whitaker, and the two of them hate each other. But very quickly, he starts to get concerned about the amount of cost that's involved and the fact that these treatments really don't seem to be very different from what was happening locally. So he starts writing a series of letters signed A Lover of Truth. And then Dr. John Prince starts responding with defending Latham with these letters that are signed PH. And in the good tradition of these letter writing campaigns, they quickly devolve into ad hominem arguments. So Prince states that Pickering's arguments, quote, render him indeed an object of pity, but place him in a sphere beneath contempt itself. And Pickering responds that he little thought that with him, truth and falsehood were terms synonymous. And so finally in February of 1774, they start to try to kill the hospital through pulling funding. And Pickering gets very upset about this, and he actually makes a list of the people that he calls the Lathamites: the Kerwins, the Pickmans, the Vanses, the Rouths, the Sparhawks, Dr. Prince. All of these people are signers of the loyal address to General Gage. So by March, I think everybody was tired of this whole thing, because the Halls, who printed the Essex Gazette, insert a thing into the paper that says, quote, we have been inadvertently led into the publication of a long dispute respecting Dr. Latham, which we have reason to think has been unsatisfactory to many of our good customers. We now assure them that in the future, no physical, ecclesiastical, or personal disputes shall unnecessarily find place in this paper to the exclusion of matters of more importance. So basically, everybody's like, we kind of want to know what's going on with the port bill. Why are you publishing all these letters about Dr. Latham? So into this mess arrives General Gage on June 2nd, 1774. 2 days later, he attends a ball for the king's birthday with about 200 ladies and gentlemen, so you think things are starting well. He took up residence at Robert Hooper's house, which is known as the Lindens in Danvers, and even bought furniture from local craftsman Nathaniel Gould. So he's looking like he's here to stay. And why the Hooper House, which is, if you're familiar with the Salem and Danvers area, it's out about where the Liberty Tree Mall is. So it's about 3 miles outside of town. We're not sure why he chose this one particularly, but his daughter-in-law was painted by John Singleton Copley in the same dress his wife was painted in. So there's got to be, and you often see this happening when there is a connection between these women in these paintings. So that's a wonderful mystery. He also dined at Robert Hooper's house in Marblehead on July 4th, according to diarist Ashley Bowen. So over the course of the summer, the number of soldiers increased in the area around Salem as tensions increased. So we ended up with one company of the 64th was encamped on Marblehead Neck on June 4th, and most of them hath wives with them, says Ashley Bowen. On July 21st, 2 more companies of the 64th encamped next to the Lindens. This is where the Lindens was located. This is the center of Salem, and this gold star is the Brown House where Gage had his office when he was in town. And on August 11th, the 59th Regiment arrived and encamped at the fort, or the new fort, which we now call Fort Lee, in the Salem Willows. Apparently there were some attractive officers in the 59th because Mrs. Holyoke, the wife of one of the local doctors, reports taking her daughter and their friend, a daughter of Governor Hutchinson, to the fort to drink tea several times in that month. So this, as I mentioned, is Salem, at about the center of Salem at about that time. The Brown House would have been, so this is Essex Street is right about here. The Brown House would have been down on this side here. So the House, as well as the local committee of correspondence, proceeded to defy General Gage that summer. On June 17th, the Speaker ordered the galleries of the Salem courthouse cleared, the doors shut, and the House proceeded to debate the state of the province and call for representatives to be sent to the First Continental Congress. Conveniently, Samuel Adams locked the door and lost the key because Gage got wind of the event and sent his secretary to dissolve the General Court. But Secretary Flucker found the doors locked and was forced to read the announcement to the locked doors on the stairs before posting it outside the door. And once they were finished assigning all these things, the delegates opened the door and were like, oh, what's this? We had no idea. So the session in Salem is just marked by tension, dissension, and outright rebellion on the part of the legislatures. Gage apparently was continually calling people into the William Brown House to meet with him. And throughout that summer, as we saw as Bob was mentioning, the Whigs really tightened their hold on both local and state politics. When the legislators and citizens of Essex County heard of the Massachusetts Government Act, which prohibited town meetings and increased the power of the governors, as Bob was talking about, these county conventions start getting organized. And the towns of Essex County called for a meeting to be held in Ipswich to discuss the situation. Here's what happens in Salem. Salem held a special town meeting to elect their delegates. And in response to the situation, when Gage hears about these plans, that's when the 59th is brought to Salem, that period in August. To try to evade the letter of the law, the town then had their committee of correspondence call the meeting on August 24th rather than the selectmen. Most of the selectmen were also the committee of correspondence. Gage then responds by calling the committee to William Brown's house. Unfortunately, Timothy Pickering writes a lengthy letter describing this whole situation. And apparently Richard Derby Jr. decided to take him on, and they spent a good hour arguing the legality of the meeting. Gage then sent the sheriff and 2 companies of the 59th to break up the meeting. But fortunately, the meeting ended before the troops arrived. Gage was lividly angry about this, and he had Justice Peter Fry, one of these guys who's related to the Oliver Hutchinson clan and a signer of the loyal address to Gage. So Judge Peter Fry swears out warrants for the arrest of the Committee of Correspondence. Pickering, who's always had problems with this sort of thing, he just went and posted bail. He didn't want to be involved. But Derby, George Williams, the other 3 members of the committee refused to post bail and were willing to go to jail. And I literally found this at 2:30 this morning. So I need to follow up on this because it was the first time that I had seen this mentioned. This is a guy who's living in Boston. He's writing to a friend, I think in Nova Scotia, and he's writing these letters sort of detailing all this news that's coming into Boston in August of '74. And it's published in like an 1893 Proceedings of the Massachusetts Historical Society. And he says, on August 26th, quote, "The latest accounts we have heard from there," i.e. Salem, "was at 10 o'clock p.m., when there were upwards of 3,000 men assembled there from adjacent towns, with full determination to rescue the committee, if they should be sent to prison, even if they were obliged to repel force by force, being sufficiently provided for such a purpose." Now, I have not seen any other mention of this gathering of militia for this, so I need to follow up on this a little bit more. Timothy Pickering would have said something about this if it had happened. So I'm wondering if this is just one of these rumors that's just flying around Massachusetts at this point. Fry and Gage backed down, however, releasing the men on their own recognizance. I think they realized that had they jailed these guys, there really would have been trouble. And as a result of this, Gage's staff becomes very concerned for his safety. John Montresor actually goes to Gage and says, "Look, you're in danger here." On August 27th, the very next day, Gage leaves Salem and does not return, although the soldiers of the 59th stay for another month and a half. And just to end it, this cartoon pretty much describes 1774 in total. This is a rider who's fallen off his horse. It's tough to read from there, but that signpost says Salem with an arrow. And then this is a mile marker to Boston. So on the way back from Salem to Boston, he completely lost control of the horse. And this must have really been what it felt like for Gage, and particularly the Salem Loyalists in the next few months. In October, as Bob Allison mentioned, the legislature comes back to Salem, and instead of doing a legislative session, they vote to create the Provincial Congress, and they effectively wrest governance from Gage at that point. On October 6th, Peter Fry's woodshed was burned by arson. And that started one of the largest fires in Salem until 1914. It destroyed Dr. Whitaker's church. It destroyed the custom house, 8 homes, 14 warehouses, shops, and barns. Then, on February 16th, 249 years ago yesterday, the soldiers came back, this time looking for stockpiled weapons. Colonel Leslie didn't find anything, but he wasn't looking very hard, and Gage's irritation with Leslie was what led to him giving much stricter orders to the troops heading for Concord in April. So I'm going to end, as one should here, with April 19th, 1775. Any questions? Nope. Okay.
Hello, it's me again. So, where we're going next, so we have our concurrent session, so listen carefully. So we do have a few minutes because we got to get things a little set up here. So we have Too Clean, incorporating appropriate levels of garment distress into your historical impression, presented by Adam Hodges LeClaire. That will be here. And then we have A Pressing Matter, Media Literacy and 18th Century Newspapers, presented by Michelle Gabrielson. That will be in room 2. So if you have to get to room or exit, and just go past the Friends registration table, take a left. And I've got a sign out there. So the Media Literacy Newspapers is going to be in room 2, and will be in here. So if you're in here for the Too Clean session, I encourage you to come up towards the front, and that way, you know, it can be a little bit more of an intimate setting. This would also be a good time to police your areas, to, you know, throw away any trash or anything like that. So we'll just try to stay ahead of it. All right, we'll convene in a few moments.